Hey guys, tonight we slip gently beneath the waves, not into a storm or a tsunami or one of those roaring cinematic ocean battles, no. We're following Poseidon, the famously temperamental god of the sea, on a day when he's anything but angry. Imagine that. No quaking tridents or earthquakes, no sea monsters chewing on ships, just a quiet descent through ribbons of light, past floating jellyfish like drifting lanterns, into the calm, echoing hush of the deep. Your ears pop once or twice as you pass through layers of salty stillness, the sea wrapping around you like a warm blue blanket. Everything slows. Time doesn't pass the same way down here. Fish blink at you lazily, kelp sways like it's stretching after a nap, and somewhere, just ahead, you glimpse a shimmer of sea glass and polished shell. Poseidon's palace. Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You land on the ocean floor with a puff of sand and silt that takes its sweet time settling. Poseidon is already ahead of you, gliding, not swimming, through the water, like he's on one of those moving walkways at an airport. His beard ripples in the current, streaked with salt and threads of seaweed he refuses to notice. Despite his reputation, storms, tempers, cracking the earth open, today Poseidon just wants some peace and quiet. Olympus has been loud lately. Zeus won't stop bragging about a lightning bolt upgrade, and Hera is on a redecorating spree that somehow made the clouds smell like lavender. Poseidon, he's had enough. And so he's come home. Home, in this case, is a palace made entirely of pressed coral and sunken statues, some of which he borrowed without asking. There's a trireme sticking out of the roof. It's fine. Artistic. You follow him through an archway of oyster shells, each one murmuring low, sleepy songs as you pass. The walls pulse faintly with the rhythm of the sea. It's not flashy in here. No gold-plated fountains or Olympus-level egos, just barnacle-chipped columns, fish swimming through picture frames, and hermit crab receptionist who gives you a suspicious glance before deciding you don't look important enough to stop. Poseidon flops, not regally, just flops, onto a large sea sponge that squishes slightly and lets out a polite sigh. His trident is leaning against a corner, forgotten. He runs a hand through his hair and releases a groan of pure relief. Finally, he mutters. A day without oracles yelling or mortals drowning themselves for favour. You blink. Well, that's one way to set the tone. According to one fragment from 3rd century BCE poet Aristarchus, who wrote exclusively in seashell metaphors, Poseidon's palace was actually built over the remains of an older sea god's house. Whether that's true or just ocean gossip is still up for debate, but either way, the place smells faintly of old kelp and unopened clam mail. You wander past a hallway where a group of clownfish are arguing over who forgot to feed the sea dragon. Around the corner, a jellyfish butler offers you a tray of glistening sea grapes. They taste like cucumber dreams. Poseidon gestures lazily toward a chair made of whale rib and seagrass. Sit if you like, or don't. It's not like time means much down here. And he's right. Down here, everything drifts. Thoughts don't rush. Words stretch. Even Poseidon's sentences feel underwater, muffled, unhurried, like he's been talking to clams too long. A giant sea turtle swims by the open window. It nods respectfully. That's their version of small talk. Historians still argue whether Poseidon ever truly lived full-time in the sea or just used it as a vacation spot. Some ancient frescoes show him lounging underwater, while others depict him tossing waves around like a frustrated soup chef. Maybe both are true. Maybe today's version of him, tired, relaxed, half listening to a sponge give weather updates, is the one they never wrote down. Bubbles drift up from the floor vents. You realize you've been slowly floating a few inches off the seat without noticing. Gravity works differently here, or maybe Poseidon's just forgotten to keep it on. As the god of the sea leans back and lazily flicks a crab off his knee, you begin to suspect something wild. Poseidon might actually be mellow. He yawns. The yawning echoes down the coral halls, and 3 eels snap to attention, thinking it's a war cry. False alarm, he mumbles. Just tired. You're not sure if he's talking to them or to you. And then, just as you're about to ask what he plans to do today, he waves a hand and says, "Nothing. Absolutely nothing. That's the plan." It is oddly perfect, because as the ocean hums, the sand whispers, and a passing squid scrawls something rude in ink on the wall, you realize this isn't going to be some thrilling tale of monsters or heroes. This is going to be Poseidon's quiet day off. And you're invited to the whole gloriously boring thing. You're still hovering, barely brushing the sponge-cushioned chair, when Poseidon shifts slightly and mutters something about his lower vertebrae feeling pickled. He doesn't seem interested in moving, though. Instead, he gestures vaguely to a low corridor carved from coral and speckled with sand dollars. "That way," he grumbles. "My throne needs dusting." You get up, not because you're eager to perform underwater royal maintenance, but because the idea of a throne made entirely of seagrass and clamshells sounds too weird not to see. Poseidon doesn't follow. He just waves a hand like a parent half-heartedly shooing a child toward chores, and you begin to float along, gently propelled by the current. The corridor hums with low notes, like the hallway itself has been singing softly for centuries. The walls are lined with fish-scale mosaics, crude renderings of Poseidon's more dramatic moments. There's the time he accidentally created the first seaquake by sneezing too hard, the time he turned a mortal into a dolphin, then forgot why, and, of course, the moment he invented horses out of sea foam, which seems biologically suspect, but the Greeks were flexible with logic. You turn a corner and there it is, the throne room. Now don't get carried away thinking this is some gold-plated monstrosity like Zeus would have. No lightning bolts, no clouds on tap. Poseidon's throne is made from braided seaweed ropes, layered driftwood, and a crown of nautilus shells so large that 3 gobies have turned it into a condo. The whole thing smells faintly of algae and faint regret. You plop down on it, it squeaks, you freeze. The throne clears its throat. Wait. What? Yes, the throne clears its throat. You glance down and realize the base is alive. A very old turtle, like really old, is fused into the bottom. He blinks up at you slowly. "You're sitting on Gerald," comes a voice from behind. It's Poseidon, floating in now with a lazy breaststroke. You jolt up. Gerald grunts in appreciation. "About time," he rumbles, voice like a tide, rolling over rocks. "That last one sat for a decade." You apologize, profusely. Gerald waves a flipper dismissively and sinks back into his algae-covered nap. Poseidon chuckles. He's mostly retired now, doesn't even do throne stuff, just likes the warmth. You wonder aloud if Poseidon ever uses the throne anymore. He snorts. Only when guests expect it, which frankly is never. You look around. The room, while cavernous, is a cluttered mess. Stacked kelp paperwork. A bucket of barnacles labelled "Do Not Eat." A fish skeleton mobile hanging crookedly from the ceiling. A trident leaning against the wall, buried in a pile of driftwood that might be mail. "You sure you're a god?" you ask. "Only on Thursdays," Poseidon says. There's a pause, a long one. "Want the tour?" "Of course you do." Poseidon snaps his fingers, and the floor, made of shimmering blue tiles, slides open like an oyster, revealing an escalator made of clam shells and sea urchins. It descends lazily, creaking with the kind of slowness only ancient underwater architecture can justify. You step on, it doesn't move, then it groans once and lurches downward like an elderly man getting up from a recliner. As you descend into the depths of the palace, Poseidon hums an off-key sea shanty under his breath. It's about krakens and taxes, possibly both. You ask if this part of the palace was always here. "Here." He shrugs. "Depends who you ask. Historians still argue whether the lower floors were part of the original temple to Thalassa, or if I added them during a mid-millennium crisis. Either way, the plumbing is atrocious. At the bottom, the escalator ends abruptly in a heap of sand. You step off and enter a chamber filled with hundreds of sea cushions, those soft, fleshy anemone chairs that hug your rear whether you like it or not. In the center, Poseidon's actual throne, the one that matters. It's not big, it's not imposing, but it is covered in living coral that glows faintly when touched. You sit, the coral sighs. "It likes you," Poseidon says, clearly surprised. You touch one of the armrests. It pulses gently. According to some obscure fragments from the 2nd century philosopher Moros of Delos, Poseidon's real seat of power wasn't his trident, but the living coral throne, thought to be grown from the ancient sea itself. Whether that's myth or metaphor or just ancient sea PR, you'll never know. But it's cozy. Poseidon sits next to you on a lopsided rock that used to be a sculpture of himself. "So," he says, popping a bubble lazily, "let's do nothing, together." And that's exactly what you do. For a long, still stretch of underwater time, you and the god of the sea sit in a glowing coral room while the ocean hums around you. A few sea spiders crawl across the ceiling. Somewhere far away, a whale sings in a key that sounds suspiciously like longing. And you begin to understand something fundamental. Not all divine days involve lightning and fury. Sometimes they just involve a comfortable throne, a napping turtle named Gerald, and a god who's decided for once not to rule, but just to rest. You're not sure how long you've been sitting there. Time in Poseidon's palace is strange. It doesn't tick or tock. It sways, it eddies, it meanders like a curious eel with nowhere in particular to be. You and Poseidon stay perched in that coral-lit chamber for what could be hours or maybe centuries, judging by how often the sea spiders do laps across the ceiling. Eventually, Poseidon stirs, not with any urgency, just that sort of stretch a cat does when it realizes it might eventually do something. He rolls his neck, which emits a distinctly volcanic cracking noise, and mutters, "Right, coral committee time." You blink. "The what now?" He sighs, the sigh of someone who once commanded tempests and now attends staff meetings. "The coral bureaucracy," he says. "It's this whole thing. They meet twice a decade. Used to be just decorative. Then I let them vote on something. Big mistake." You're ushered into a new hallway, this one lined with vertical coral stalks that pulse faintly like glowing veins. Poseidon trails one hand along the wall, and the coral gently retracts to open a passage. On the other side, an underwater courtroom, complete with a gavel-shaped sea cucumber and rows of coral benches shaped like lounge chairs. Floating above them are the committee members, mostly crustaceans, crabs in tiny togas, shrimp with clipboards, one very large and overly confident lobster who clearly thinks he runs the place. They argue about zoning laws, Poseidon whispers to you, but it always ends in interpretive dance. As you drift to your seat, the crab in charge raps the gavel cucumber once. It jiggles alarmingly. The chamber hushes. "First order of business," the crab clicks, "is the East Reef expansion plan, which may encroach upon the sacred sandbank of the Blue Goby Guild." A smaller crab raises a claw. "Objection! That sandbank is vital for our annual molting ceremony and buffet." The lobster interjects. "Irrelevant. We all know the gobies bring their own snacks." Poseidon leans toward you. "This'll take a while. Want a snack?" You nod. He pulls out a pouch of dried kelp crisps, sea salty and suspiciously addictive. While the crustaceans bicker about territory and whether plankton-based construction counts as sustainable, you start noticing the background details. One crab has a tiny monocle. A shrimp is using its antennae to knit. The jellyfish stenographer is asleep, but still accurately transcribing via bioluminescent pulses. And then, inevitably, it begins. The interpretive dance. Two anemones drift up to the center chamber and begin swaying their tentacles in what might be symbolic protest or just an itchy rash. It's hard to tell. The committee applauds politely. The lobster seems moved to tears. "Last time," Poseidon murmurs, "they danced for 40 minutes about fishing permit fees. Nothing changed." You lean back and try not to giggle. The coral bench makes a soothing burbling sound beneath you, like it appreciates your efforts to stay composed. According to a lost play by Menocrates of Rhodes, rediscovered in a sponge-lined amphora in the 1800s, the sea gods once held councils with mortal philosophers. Apparently, things dissolved after someone tried to tax the tides. Whether or not these crustacean debates are a holdover from that golden age, no one can agree. Historians still argue whether the underwater bureaucratic systems were symbolic, ceremonial, or just Poseidon's way of outsourcing the boring bits. The debate ends not with a vote, but with a group nap. Literally. The crabs stack themselves into a spiraling cuddle pile, and the room dims itself in response. Poseidon yawns again. Every time. You follow him out through a tunnel lined with translucent seagrass. The blades whisper as you pass, like distant chimes underwater. He gestures to a hallway you hadn't noticed before, darker, quieter, lined with gently glowing barnacles. "We'll take the scenic route," he says. You meander through corridors filled with small, curious creatures who blink and disappear when you look too closely. One hallway smells strongly of salted licorice and regret. Another is filled with perfectly balanced pebbles, stacked into strange, calming sculptures. Finally, you emerge into what looks like an atrium, but underwater. Floating above is a dome of glass blown from volcanic vents, holding back the press of ocean with delicate curves. Light spills down through it in scattered rays, illuminating a massive mural carved into the walls. It's Poseidon. Dozens of him, all the classic poses, trident raised, sea storm raging, ship sinking in the background. But then, less dramatic ones. Poseidon holding a fish like a trophy. Poseidon napping. Poseidon braiding kelp into a small crown for a sea otter. You stare. He shrugs. You get bored of the same mythology after a while. It's unexpectedly touching, a reminder that even gods get tired of being one-note legends, that even Poseidon, lord of oceans, shaker of earth, bearer of the salty beard, wants to be seen as something other than a tempest with muscles. Just then, a small crab scuttles in, bearing a scroll. "Your tide schedules, sir?" It squeaks. Poseidon groans. "I forgot we still did those." He doesn't open it. Instead, he hands it to a passing squid and says, "File that under eventually." The squid salutes, with 8 arms. You and Poseidon step into a wide chamber with a soft sand floor. He flops down, limbs askew, eyes half-lidded. "I'm done for today," he says. You lie down beside him, sand cradling you like a memory. The water hushes over your ears, and for a moment, the sea is nothing but gentle silence. The crab bureaucrats, the dancing anemones, the scent of kelp crisps and sea turtle naps, they all blur into the stillness. Poseidon sighs deep and long, like waves settling after a storm. "Tomorrow," he says, "we visit the archives." Of course you will. Morning, or whatever passes for it under the sea, comes quietly. No alarm clocks, no screeching roosters, just the gentle shimmer of sunlight filtering through miles of seawater and bouncing across the vaulted coral ceiling in liquid patterns. You blink awake to find Poseidon still lying next to you, snoring softly, one sandal floating above his foot like it's considering escaping. You sit up slowly. No rush. Nothing under here is in a rush. And besides, Poseidon's version of getting up involves a good 30 minutes of groaning, stretching and yelling mildly at the seaweed that tangled itself around his ankle overnight. Eventually he rolls to his side and mutters, "Right, archives." You help him up. Well, not help so much as float nearby in case something creaks too loudly, and he leads you down a hallway crusted with mother-of-pearl tiles. As you drift through, the walls subtly change colour, matching Poseidon's mood. Today they're a sleepy teal. The path curves until you reach a set of double doors made of hammered driftwood and whalebone, carved with spirals that seem to move when you're not looking. This is the Octopus Archives. The moment the doors creak open, you are hit with the briny, papery scent of ancient sea scrolls, dried ink, and... is that pickled herring? A large, bespectacled octopus sits behind a desk made of old ship rudders, holding 6 pens at once and scribbling on 6 different scrolls. The 7th arm adjusts his reading glasses. The 8th is drinking espresso from a bubble-tight cup. He looks up. "Poseidon," he says without looking thrilled. "You're 2 centuries late returning those shell tablets." Poseidon waves a dismissive hand. "Put it on my tab, Ollo." The octopus, Ollo apparently, clicks his beak and mutters something about gods and their overdue epics. You look around. Towering coral shelves spiral up into dim blue shadows, stuffed with scrolls, clay tablets, bundles of seaweed tied in careful knots, and what might be petrified jellyfish diaries. Tiny shrimp zip up and down the stacks in little elevators made from barnacle husks, retrieving documents and shushing each other despite making no sound whatsoever. "People think Olympus has all the secrets," Poseidon says. "But down here we've got the receipts." He pulls a scroll off a shelf. It's labelled Siren Song Frequencies and their effects on ancient fishing patterns. He hands it to you. "This one's fun. Turns out the songs were less about seduction and more about disrupting echolocation. Dolphin unions still complain about it. You leaf through it, or rather, you unroll it very slowly while trying not to rip the seaweed fibres. Inside is a neat chart tracking siren choruses against a graph of shipwreck locations. It's surprisingly data-driven. Poseidon chuckles and moves toward a locked cabinet that opens when he hums a very off-key note. From inside, he removes a heavy book, bound in stingray leather, etched with barnacle calligraphy. On the front, Tales Not Told, Poseidon's Mildest Moments. You raise an eyebrow. He shrugs. "Everyone remembers the horses and earthquakes. Nobody cares about the time I saved a jellyfish from choking on its own tentacles." According to an inscription near the back of the book, Poseidon once spent 100 years mediating a feud between 2 neighbouring kelp forests over boundary lines. The story was so dull that it caused 4 scribes to abandon writing altogether and take up silent oyster farming. Historians still argue whether this event marked the true beginning of what's now considered non-violent divine intervention literature. You drift through the aisles, letting your fingers trail along papyrus wrapped in eel skin and clay shards covered in cryptic doodles, some of which look suspiciously like early cartoons. One features Poseidon slipping on a sea urchin with the caption, "Triton, quit leaving these around." Ollo the octopus hands you a scroll with a skeptical glance. You may find this one illuminating. You unfurl it. It's a hand-drawn map of an underwater labyrinth said to be used by Poseidon during his introvert phase. A place to hide when godly drama became too much. Apparently, it was soundproof, echo-free, and had the world's first underwater beanbag chair. Poseidon peers over your shoulder. Still exists, bit dusty now, also infested with gossiping moray eels. You look up. "Can we visit?" He pauses, tentacles of hair floating lazily. "Sure, but first one more stop." He gestures toward a smaller alcove, inside a display case lit by soft bioluminescence. Within it sits an early prototype of the trident, not the gleaming, polished, lightning-channeling icon we all know. This one's made of driftwood and tied with kelp string, its prongs uneven, its shaft bent slightly, like it lost a wrestling match with a swordfish. "My first trident," Poseidon says wistfully. "Made it myself, before branding was a thing." You smile, it's oddly charming. Next to the trident is a plaque that reads, "Sometimes the god builds the weapon, sometimes the weapon builds the god, and sometimes it just pokes jellyfish." You leave the archives with your mind filled, not with war stories, but with long-forgotten moments of soft, absurd, peaceful godhood. A world of paperwork, lost hobbies, and quietly profound seaweed poetry. Poseidon stretches again and says, "Right then, let's go visit the eel-infested sanctuary of solitude, shall we?" You nod, heart calm, curiosity adrift, and off you float, deeper into the slow, silent folds of Poseidon's underwater world. The path to the so-called eel sanctuary is not marked by signs or majestic arches, just a narrow tunnel half covered in mossy kelp and barnacle graffiti. You wouldn't even notice it unless you were looking for a place absolutely no one wants to stumble into by accident, which, to be fair, is exactly the point. Poseidon brushes aside a curtain of wriggling seaweed strands and says, "Watch your head. The eels like to drop things." You ask what kind of things? He just says, "Opinions." As you follow him in, the water grows cooler and the colours dim. The warm blues and corals of the palace fade into muted greys and soft, almost sleepy greens. Tiny flecks of glowing plankton drift past your face like sparks from a very relaxed bonfire. The tunnel narrows, then suddenly opens into a vast dome carved into solid rock. The space is eerily quiet, like sound got lost on the way in. Floating just above the ground in coils and loops and lazy spirals are the residents, eels, dozens of them, long, whispery, and entirely uninterested in your presence. One is playing with a seashell like it's a Rubik's Cube, another is knitting with its tail. Poseidon waves. "Still brooding, I see." A very large moray eel looks up from its embroidery project and says in a slow, syrupy voice, "We are discussing philosophy." "Sure you are," Poseidon mutters, leading you to a rock bench worn smooth by what appears to be many, many centuries of sulking. The room isn't just a sanctuary, it's a kind of underwater monastery of size and minor existential dread. Apparently, this was Poseidon's hideaway centuries ago, during a particularly exhausting period of Olympian gossip wars. According to a half-forgotten Hellenistic hymn, he once spent 12 years down here reading only clamshell haikus and avoiding Zeus's messages. Historians still argue whether this retreat was a form of protest, burnout, or just really dramatic introversion. You sit beside him. He sighs. It echoes slowly, bouncing off the curved ceiling like a sleepy boomerang. A nearby eel offers you both a cup of something called brine tea. It tastes like salt water that's been whispering secrets to an old sponge. Not bad, actually. Poseidon stretches his legs and murmurs, "I used to nap in here during wars." You blink. Trojan War? Oh yeah. Took a break right in the middle, left a sea clone to yell at Odysseus. No one noticed. The eels hum in collective agreement. One of them turns toward you. "Would you like to contribute to the circle of unresolvable questions?" You nod, partly because you're polite, and partly because this feels like one of those underwater cultural rites where saying no results in someone reciting 48 lines of kelp verse. The eel unrolls a shell-shaped scroll and reads aloud, "If a drop of water becomes the ocean, does the ocean become the drop?" Poseidon leans over. They've been stuck on that one since Atlantis sank. You sit quietly, pretending to think deeply while actually wondering how many fish snacks might be acceptable to eat in a sacred eel sanctuary. A very small eel hands you a seashell engraved with a crude drawing of Poseidon sitting in this very room, chin in hand, surrounded by question marks. The caption reads, "God of Stillness." Poseidon stares at it for a moment, then grins. "Keep it," he says. "Souvenir." After a while, the philosophical murmuring quiets. The eels begin to coil into loose circles and fall into their meditative state, which strongly resembles a nap. The water settles into a hush so complete that your own heartbeat feels like it's echoing through the floor. You begin to understand the appeal of this place, not just as a hideaway from celestial politics, but as a refuge from everything: time, duty, even personality. Down here, you're just a creature in water, with nothing expected of you except gentle presence. Poseidon watches the room like he's reading an old journal he forgot he wrote. Then, with the careful ceremony of someone touching memory, he stands and taps the ground with one bare foot. The floor opens, just a crack. Inside is a compartment no one else in the room reacts to, either because they don't care, or because eels operate on a strictly if-it-doesn't-involve-me policy. Poseidon lifts out a small barnacle-covered box. "This," he says, brushing it off slowly, "is where I kept my first prayer." You tilt your head. He smiles softly. "Some kid in a fishing village ages ago asked me to make it rain so his parents could take a break from hauling nets. I didn't even know how to respond. I wasn't the god of rain, but I liked the thought. He opens the box. Inside, a tiny charm made of sea glass and thread, fragile, handmade, still intact. Poseidon closes the lid with quiet fingers and slides it back into the hollow. You don't say anything, neither does he. You just float there, in the calm, in the stillness, with the quiet wisdom of eels wrapping around you like a blanket of old thoughts. And then, just as the moment begins to dissolve into dream, Poseidon says, "Want to see where I keep the dolphin post office?" You blink. He grins. They're faster than you'd think. Also way more dramatic. Of course you're going. And just like that, the sanctuary fades behind you, soft, slow and sacred, as you drift onward, deeper still, into the absurdly calm underlife of a god who's not done surprising you yet. You leave the eel sanctuary through another passageway that looks exactly like all the others, unassuming, slightly crooked, and exuding that faint smell of wet parchment and philosophical ennui. Poseidon hums to himself as he leads the way, occasionally flicking sea dust off coral ledges and swatting away a nosy seahorse with all the urgency of someone brushing lint off their bathrobe. "Right," he says, adjusting nothing in particular. To the Dolphin Courier Service. Now, when you think of divine message delivery, you probably imagine something grand, winged sandals, maybe a rainbow, perhaps a flaming chariot of celestial scrolls. But Poseidon's system, let's just say it has more personality. The tunnel opens into a vast atrium shaped like a sunken amphitheatre. Spiral ramps of limestone circle downward toward a wide, open basin glowing with warm bioluminescent algae. And inside that basin, dolphins. Not dozens, not hundreds. Thousands. And they are loud. You're greeted by a wave of chirps, squeaks, backflips, tail slaps, and what might be the underwater equivalent of someone trying to sing opera while eating a sea cucumber. Poseidon raises both hands. All right, calm down. No one's lost a scroll this time." The dolphins settle. Kind of. A few are still breakdancing for reasons unclear. You learn quickly that these aren't ordinary dolphins. These are divine couriers, trained, stubborn, and painfully dramatic. Each wears a harness made of braided kelp and sea silk, equipped with scroll tubes, shell trinkets, and on one individual, a monocle and velvet sash. That one approaches you immediately. "This," Poseidon says, "is Admiral Clicksworth. Don't let the monocle fool you. He once delivered a love poem through a hurricane and a Kraken bar mitzvah." Clicksworth does a perfect 360-degree twirl and presents you with a waterlogged scroll. It unrolls to reveal a grocery list from a mortal asking Poseidon for less fishy-smelling fish. Poseidon sighs. Honestly, what do they think I am, a seafood sommelier? According to one obscure tablet recovered from a 4th century BCE dive site off the coast of Crete, Poseidon's dolphin couriers formed the first underwater male guild. They had rules, rankings, even seasonal uniforms, shell hats, allegedly. Historians still argue whether these accounts were literal truth or simply metaphorical depictions of efficient oceanic currents. Either way, the dolphins take themselves very seriously. A bell rings, a soft chime made by tapping 2 oyster shells together. All the dolphins instantly snap to attention. Even Clicksworth freezes mid-pose. One of Poseidon's assistants, a pufferfish wearing pince-nez glasses, floats into view holding a massive bundle of scrolls. "Your correspondence, sir," it puffs. "Backlog from the past. 36 tides." Poseidon winces. "Ugh, that's at least 3 festivals, 4 droughts, and a dozen messages from Triton begging for a promotion." The pufferfish nods, then promptly deflates with a soft pweep and drifts away like a forgotten balloon. As the scrolls are sorted, dolphins begin lining up in choreographed squads, each squad led by a captain sporting uniquely bedazzled harnesses. One squad has glittery sea glass accents, another wears matching sand dollar pins. One ambitious dolphin has painted its tail like a Grecian urn. Poseidon pats you on the back. "We used to send messages by whale, but they're terrible with dates and emotionally clingy." You ask where today's messages are going. He flips through a few scrolls casually. "Let's see, One to a sailor off the coast of Sicily, reminding him he's not actually cursed, just unlucky. Another to a coral reef, asking it to grow left instead of right. Oh, and this one's from Medusa. Still thinks I owe her a mixtape. Yikes. Suddenly a conch shell horn sounds. Poseidon perks up. That's the drama horn. You brace yourself. A panicked dolphin with a frazzled seaweed bandana skids into the room, chirping rapidly and waving a broken scroll tube. Poseidon listens, then groans. Lost another package near the Mariana Trench. That route is cursed, I swear. He looks at you. Feel like a field trip? Before you can answer, you're swept into motion. Poseidon clicks his fingers, and two dolphins sidle up beside you, gesturing with their heads to climb on. Their names, as you're informed mid-mount, are Blip and Sandwich. Yes, Sandwich. You grip the harness, slightly unsure, but Poseidon's already launched himself onto his own dolphin like a weary sea cowboy. And with a whoosh of flippers, you're off. The speed is astonishing. Currents whip past your face like silken wind, and bioluminescent plankton burst around you like underwater fireworks. You dive through hoops of reef, spiral around shipwrecks draped in seaweed curtains, and pass a pair of arguing sea lions who barely register your dolphin convoy. Poseidon whoops, an undignified but entirely authentic sound of joy. We don't get out enough anymore. At one point, Sandwich does a barrel roll just to show off. Blip retaliates with a corkscrew turn that leaves your stomach 3 seconds behind the rest of you. Finally, you arrive at a jagged ravine, dark, cold, with a tension in the water that feels like forgotten secrets. This, Poseidon explains, is the drop zone. The scroll must have slipped during a sudden current shift or been stolen by something nosy and tentacled. You dive down together, lower, colder, quieter, down where even the eels don't gossip. Eventually, nestled between two glowing sea sponges, you find it, a waterlogged scroll tube with a cracked clasp. Inside, a message from a lonely sailor asking Poseidon for just one peaceful night's rest at sea. Poseidon holds it for a moment. Then he closes his eyes. You feel something shift in the current, a gentle pulse. Promise. Somewhere far above that sailor's ship will rock just a little less tonight. The dolphins nod in approval, and just like that you're heading back. Faster this time, triumphant. The scroll safe, the message read, the storm calmed before it even began. Back at headquarters, Clicksworth does a celebratory backflip and awards you a $100 pin. Poseidon tries not to tear up. Don't lose that, he says. It's honorary and slightly edible. You smile, heart-light, hair slightly askew, from dolphin speed. Another quiet victory in the very calm, very strange underworld of Poseidon's less famous days. You tuck the slightly squishy $100 pin into a pouch Poseidon conjures from a passing stingray. Don't ask how, it's apparently standard courier protocol, and thank Admiral Clicksworth for his services. The dolphin bows deeply, then does a final backflip for flair before darting off toward the horizon, trailed by a glittering squadron of aquatic male workers. Poseidon exhales, long and slow. Well, that was productive, he says, rubbing his temples. Time for something a bit more archival. You raise an eyebrow. More scrolls? He shakes his head. Worse, the engineers. The phrase alone seems to trigger something in the palace itself. A soft whirring sound begins, like an underwater fan slowly waking up from a long nap. The current stiffens slightly as if bracing for what's ahead. Poseidon guides you into a descending hallway carved out of volcanic stone and laced with ancient wiring. Eels, mostly. You glance at the walls. They're lined with glass tubes filled with zipping electric fish, each emitting a faint buzz like they're having urgent conversations in Morse code. The lights flicker with personality, some twinkle politely, others blink in full tantrum mode. These, Poseidon mutters as you walk past a panel sparking quietly, are the eel-powered infrastructure corridors. A brilliant idea on paper. The hallway ends in a broad chamber that looks part laboratory, part mechanics garage, part very confused aquarium. In the center, a huge console made from coral, stone, bronze, and what might be the rudder of an ancient Phoenician cargo ship. Dozens of eels slither in and out of sockets, humming softly as they power various machines, most of which seem to be vibrating or leaking something. A voice booms, "Welcome, Sea Lord." Poseidon winces. "Don't do that, Glorblax, we talked about this." From behind the main console emerges a creature that can best be described as a jellyfish wearing a lab coat. Glorblax, chief systems engineer and former cloud wrangler, floats forward on stubby pseudopods and extends a clipboard that is instantly soggy. "We've had several power surges in the kelp escalator system," Glorblax chirps. "Also, one of the sea cucumber turnstiles began experiencing existential dread and refused to rotate." Poseidon gestures wearily. "Fix it gently." Glorblax salutes and glides back into the machinery, where several eels are now blinking in unison like they're composing an electrical poem. You wander toward a side chamber where several jellyfish and squid are hunched over diagrams of what looks like Poseidon's trident, except it's been redesigned. A passing squid nods and says, "This new version vibrates slightly and glows when you've forgotten where you left it." Poseidon peers over the design. "Does it also stop me from accidentally stirring my tea with it?" "Unlikely," the squid replies. "But we're working on a coaster that beeps." In the corner, two lobsters are assembling a kind of underwater Roomba powered by barnacles. You watch as it attempts to clean the floor, pauses to ponder the meaning of coral dust, and then gently bumps into a pillar and gives up. "Prototype," Poseidon whispers, very sensitive. According to a half-preserved inscription on an ancient amphora found near Thera, Poseidon was once worshipped not just as god of the sea, but as master of the mechanisms. Whether this refers to tidal machines, oceanic architecture, or simply the divine tendency to tinker with things he doesn't understand, no one agrees. Historians still argue whether this mechanical obsession was myth, metaphor, or just a way to explain why half of his temples flooded annually. One eel-powered elevator screeches to life and immediately dies again with a dignified puff of bubbles. Poseidon sighs. "They try, bless them." At this point, Glorblax floats back, holding what looks like a clipboard made of translucent jelly. "Good news," he says. "The escalators are humming in a lower key, which means only minor discontent." "Good enough," Poseidon replies. He turns to you with the expression of someone who's just attended a 5-hour meeting about printer cartridges. "Ready to leave this den of genius?" "Absolutely." As you make your way out, a crab in a hard hat offers you a tiny wrench made from compressed pearl dust. "Visitor's token," he says. "Also opens vending clams." You thank him, slip it into your pouch next to the sand dollar pin, and follow Poseidon back through the blinking halls of slightly neurotic eels. "Used to be, I'd shake the earth and the world would listen," Poseidon mutters as you drift upward. "Now I oversee repairs on seashell plumbing and emotional elevators." He doesn't sound bitter. Just sound bitter. Bemused, at the top of P of the hall, a stone arch opens into a quiet chamber filled with softly tinkling wind chimes made from old fish bones and driftwood. The sound is gentle, hypnotic. A place to transition, to exhale. Poseidon leans against the wall and closes his eyes. "I know it doesn't look like much," he says, voice low. "But all this, keeps the sea from falling apart. The chaos above gets all the stories, all the songs. But down here, we maintain the rhythm." You nod. The eels, the dolphins, the soft-spoken engineers, even the sea cucumber turnstiles with their tiny, existential meltdowns. It all adds up to a strange, quiet system of care, of balance. Poseidon opens one eye. "Want to see something weirder?" You don't answer. You just smile, because of course you do. Poseidon doesn't wait for your answer, not because he's rude, but because he's already halfway through a glowing archway shaped like an enormous clam that never quite closes. You follow, drifting past rows of sleepy barnacles and seagrass strands, tangled into what might be poetry or just ambitious algae graffiti. You half expect the next chamber to be a secret vault or another chaotic engineering room, but instead it's oddly elegant. You step into a vast ballroom carved directly into a shelf of coral limestone, bathed in soft lavender light from bioluminescent globes dangling from the ceiling like jellyfish chandeliers. The floor is polished abalone, iridescent and slick, and every few seconds it shifts colour in waves, pale blue to rose gold to something you can only describe as forgotten lavender. At the centre of the room, a runway, and on that runway, jellyfish, strutting. Poseidon grins like a kid who knows the magician's next trick. "Welcome," he says with a little bow, "to the seasonal jellyfish fashion show." You blink. A conch horn sounds, soft, classy, full of bubbles. The show begins. A large, translucent jellyfish glides forward, wearing what appears to be a toga made from woven seagrass threads and dotted with pearls. It twirls gracefully, and a few nearby shrimp applaud by wiggling. Behind it comes another model, puffed slightly like it's holding its breath, showing off what you realize is a belt made entirely of miniature barnacle hats. It stops dramatically, pulses once for emphasis, then floats backward with practiced elegance. You lean toward Poseidon. "Is this common?" "Very," he replies. "Jellyfish are surprisingly vain, and trendsetters too. Back in the 3rd century BCE, a philosopher tried to mimic their style for human robes, failed, miserably, drowned. But fashion, dangerous business." According to fragments found in a shipwreck near Mytilene, ancient sailors once believed jellyfish fashion dictated the health of the sea. When they dressed well, the tides were kind. Historians still argue whether this belief was symbolic or simply the result of spending too many months without vegetables. One jellyfish glides out wearing what might be best described as a toga crossed with a disco ball. It rotates slowly, and the light glints off its shimmering cap like Poseidon's trident in a nightclub. He claps, delighted. "That one's called Lucinda. Her last outfit caused a territorial dispute among reef octopuses. Real icon." The fashion continues. One model trails a translucent cape that sparkles with embedded starfish. Another wears a hat, a literal hat, carved from spiral coral, wobbling slightly as it floats down the runway. There's no music, but the current moves in rhythmic pulses and the entire room sways with it, like the sea itself is nodding in approval. The crowd, a mix of undersea dignitaries, anemones wearing monocles, a pair of stonefish pretending not to care. Even the eel philosophers from earlier have shown up, clustered in a corner and murmuring judgments with subtle flicks of their fins. A young sea slug whispers, "Avant-garde!" and everyone gasps. Poseidon turns to you, utterly at peace. They don't need temples or hymns, just admiration, and a decent lighting crew. The final jellyfish arrives. It's the oldest of them all, wrinkled in jellyfish terms, moving slowly, wearing nothing but a single, perfectly placed seashell on top of its bell. The room falls silent. It spins once, deliberately. The abalone floor shifts from gold to deep violet. Then it floats off, trailing dignity in its wake. Everyone bursts into applause, except the stonefish. But that's just their face. Poseidon wipes a pretend tear. And they say gods don't appreciate art. You're ushered backstage, where jellyfish models are gently pulsing with pride, while tiny shrimp assistants rush about adjusting garments, reapplying sea glitter, and offering kelp smoothies. One jellyfish nods at you. You nod back, unsure whether you've just made a friend or been judged by someone with no facial features. Poseidon leads you toward a quieter alcove at the edge of the ballroom. It's small, cozy. A faint current carries the scent of sea roses and old parchment. Inside, framed on the walls, are sketches, dozens of them, all early fashion designs, all Poseidon's. "I used to dabble," he says, suddenly sheepish. "Not everything has to be a tsunami." You study one of the designs, a tunic made of coral lace, accented by a belt of braided kelp and ink-stained pearls. You glance at him. He shrugs. "I like textures." According to a rare scroll from a Minoan workshop, some of the earliest dye techniques may have originated from sea gods experimenting with fashion. Whether this was divine influence or simply local fishermen trying not to look like damp driftwood, no one knows. But the connection remains whispered in certain textile circles, especially the ones run by sea urchins. You linger in the alcove a while longer, the sound of jellyfish laughter echoing softly down the hall. Poseidon sighs. "That's enough beauty for one tide." You nod, slipping a tiny, glittering seagrass bracelet into your pouch beside the sand dollar pin and the crab wrench. Your collection of strange underwater mementos is growing, like a diary made of other people's quiet moments. As you float back through the glowing arches, Poseidon hums to himself, a soft tune that matches the sway of the ballroom and the sparkle of the sea. "Tomorrow," he says, "we're checking on the lost plankton city." Because of course there's a lost plankton city, and of course you're going. The next morning, if you can still call anything morning in a world without clocks, sunrises or urgency, Poseidon appears at your side holding a small, trembling seahorse and a half-eaten kelp pastry. He's humming something that sounds suspiciously like an ancient sea hymn mashed together with a 1990s sitcom theme. "Ready?" he asks, offering the pastry. It's oat sponge, little chewy, but it grows on you. You take a polite bite. It does, in fact, grow on you, literally. Just a little moss, though, probably fine. "We're off to the lost city of plankton today," Poseidon says cheerfully. "Technically a micronation, very sensitive about being called small." You follow him through a series of tunnels that narrow with each turn until you're swimming sideways, just to squeeze through one particularly nosy passage that keeps whispering things like, "You sure you're fit?" and "Maybe skip lunch next time?" Finally, the space widens into a massive vertical shaft. It plunges downward into velvety blackness that sparkles faintly, like someone spilled stars into the deep. Poseidon claps his hands. A moment later, a small glowing shrimp zips into view. It's pulling what looks like a rickety gondola made from clam shells and twine, suspended by threads of sea silk and optimism. You both climb in. "Hold your breath," Poseidon says. You do. Not because you need to breathe, but because it somehow feels appropriate. The gondola descends slowly, with dramatic creaking noises that are almost certainly intentional. As you drop deeper into the abyss, everything around you grows quieter. No fish, no eels. Just the sound of the water pressing gently against your ears and the occasional nervous mutter from the shrimp gondolier, who seems to be reciting multiplication tables to stay calm. After a long, suspenseful silence, the gloom parts. There, at the base of the trench, nestled between folds of sediment and forgotten shells, lies a tiny city, barely larger than a dinner plate. Buildings made from compressed plankton, walkways of scallop membrane, flags fashioned from fish-scale fragments, and plankton, thousands of them, glowing faintly, murmuring, zipping about in tight little swirls of community anxiety. "Welcome," Poseidon says, arms spread like a realtor showing off a very boutique rental property, to Plankteria. The entire city pulses with quiet pride. A delegation approaches, 4 plankton in formal wear, a bow tie, a monocle, a tiny hat, and what might be a cape made from seahorse dander. The tallest one steps forward. "Poseidon, you're late?" Poseidon bows. "Fashionably?" They nod, grudgingly impressed. You're handed a visitor's badge the size of a grain of rice and told not to breathe too loudly. Then you're ushered into the Capitol building, a spiraled conch shell perched atop a mound of sediment, with Planktaria Forever scratched across the door. Inside, it's chaos. Apparently the city is in crisis because the northeast spiral has been encroaching on the brine farming zone, and the western float path is clogged with jellyfish selfies. The mayor, a particularly excitable plankton named Quibbit, is pacing back and forth, trailing phosphorescence with every fretful loop. "Every time we fix one thing," he squeaks, "the tide shifts again." Poseidon whispers to you, "This is every visit." They're dramatic, but sincere. He kneels beside the mayor, floats beside, Poseidon doesn't kneel for much, and offers a seashell chart that reads, "Proposed current redirection plan, just move. Move left." Quibbit stares. Brilliant! A council vote is held. It passes. All 4 members wave flags. A microscopic parade breaks out. Confetti, well, bioluminescent crumbs, rains from above. Someone in the back yells, "Free phytoplankton!" A plankton band strikes up a jaunty tune with instruments so small you can barely hear them. A square dance begins. Poseidon smiles as he watches the plankton spin, their glowing trails forming tiny constellations in the water. "They're proud of what they've built," he murmurs, "even if they forget it's built on a sea cucumber's back." You tilt your head. "What?" He points down, and sure enough, beneath the entire city, a massive sea cucumber is sleeping. Its soft, ridged back serves as the foundation for Planktaria. It snores quietly, causing gentle tremors every few seconds. "You ever tell them?" you ask. Poseidon shrugs. "Once, caused a panic. They tried to pass an ordinance banning cucumbers." He lets the moment hang. "So now I just reinforce the snooze cycle and leave them to it." According to a fragment of the Lost Tides Codex, a document scribbled in kelp ink and forgotten under a sponge pile for 700 years, Poseidon's interest in micro-civilizations was viewed as eccentric. "A god should not stoop to whispers," one Olympian once said, to which Poseidon reportedly replied, "Perhaps the sea whispers better than it roars." Historians still argue whether this quote is authentic or just jellyfish propaganda. Back on the gondola leaving Planktaria behind, you spot a group of plankton forming a farewell message by glowing in synchronized flashes. "Thank you, sea friend," Poseidon waves. The shrimp gondolier pulls the lever and you rise slowly back toward the upper palace. You glance at Poseidon. "That seemed important to you." He nods. "The big things get all the credit. Storms, temples, tsunamis. But sometimes it's the plankton that matter." You don't say anything, you just float, feeling the deep silence of the sea below you and the echoes of a city that will never appear on maps, but still manages to matter. You reach the palace again with that gentle kind of tired, usually reserved for long museum visits or reading 10 pages of seafood diplomacy. The gondola plops gently against the coral dock, and the shrimp gondolier gives you a dramatic little salute before jetting off sideways, probably to write a sonnet about what he's just seen. Poseidon stretches an exaggerated ripple-through-the-ribs kind of stretch and lets out a grunt that echoes down the hallway. "That's enough civic responsibility for one tide," he mutters. "Let's go see something abandoned." Naturally. He leads you through a winding corridor lit with soft flickers from glowworm barnacles. Each flicker hums like a tiny sigh, and every few meters you pass an ancient mosaic, some depicting dolphins wrestling sea monsters, others just grapes. No one seems to remember why the grapes. The path ends at a spiral staircase made entirely of petrified kelp. It's very crunchy. Poseidon warns you not to touch anything that looks like it might crumble and hold a grudge. You descend slowly into a chamber that smells like dust and sea salt and a vague sense of nostalgia. The walls are encrusted with old carvings and half-buried relics, things that once meant something but haven't seen a worshipper in centuries. "This," Poseidon says, sweeping his arms wide, "was my sunken temple, one of the first, back when being a sea god meant more than approving tide charts and judging jellyfish accessories. The space is eerie in the most peaceful way. Soft currents drift through collapsed columns. A sea turtle sleeps inside an old offering bowl. Statues of Poseidon loom from the shadows, most missing tridents, arms or noses. You float past a cracked mural that once showed Poseidon besting a sea giant, but now just looks like 2 squid playing patty cake. "Doesn't get many visitors these days," he murmurs. "Mortals used to come down here in visions or dreams. Now they send text to the sky asking for Wi-Fi." You drift beside him in silence for a while. According to first-century records from a poet-dreamer named Timarete of Delos, Poseidon's temples were once portals for sacred sleep, a place where dream divers sought clarity from the deep. Whether these temples truly existed beneath the waves or simply within the dreaming mind, historians still argue, especially the ones who fall asleep during conferences. Poseidon runs a hand along the wall. This used to be covered in offerings, shells, carvings, sometimes just whispers, but that was enough. He smiles faintly. Now it's mostly barnacle squatters. You examine an old plinth that once held something important, maybe a ceremonial conch or a statue of Poseidon brushing his beard. Now there's a pile of sea moss, 2 starfish playing a silent staring contest, and a sign, probably added by a crab, that reads, "Do not disturb, conference in session." A few chambers deeper, Poseidon stops in front of a mosaic that hasn't aged well. It shows him blessing the first dolphin fleet, but his face is oddly stretched, like the artist hadn't quite figured out noses yet. He squints. Why does it look like I'm screaming? You squint too? Maybe you were excited. He chuckles. Or maybe I saw what they were about to do to my nose. You both sit at the edge of a collapsed fountain, where gentle jets of water still spurt every few minutes out of sheer habit. A school of tiny fish circles lazily above you in the shape of an octagon, then reshuffles into what might be the word air. A crab clambers past, wearing half a seashell like a cape. Poseidon watches it go. They used to chant my name here, he says softly. Now the echo forgets how to pronounce it. He doesn't sound bitter, just reflective, like someone flipping through a photo album and realizing some pages are blank where memories used to be. You ask if he misses the worship. He shrugs. Not really. Worship always came with drama, expectations, lightning envy. He taps his temple. I miss being wondered about. There's a pause, not an awkward one, just wide, quiet, deep as the sea. Then Poseidon rises and says, "Come on, time to check on the trident." You follow him through another hall, this one half collapsed and patrolled by 2 very defensive octopuses who seem to think they're temple guards. They let you through only after Poseidon bribes them with a shiny pebble and a very convincing dance move. You arrive at a narrow chamber, just a nook, really. Inside, a stand made of coral branches, and leaning against it, his real trident. Not the prototype, not the tourist version. The one with the subtle glow. The one that hums when you get too close. Poseidon approaches it reverently, brushing a layer of silt from the handle. Used to feel heavy, he says, like a crown you had to hold. You notice it now, tiny notches along the shaft, marks that don't look decorative, like they're memories made physical. He lifts it, slowly, and the room shivers slightly. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to remind everything nearby that the sea still knows his name. Then he sets it down again. Still fits, he says. But I don't wear it every day, that's how you get shoulder pain. You chuckle. He nods toward the archway. Next, we find the council letters from Rome. Neptune's been writing again. You groan. Passive-aggressive letters? Oh yes, Poseidon grins. And this time, he's mad about dolphins. You float out together, leaving the sunken temple behind, its forgotten mosaics watching silently as you go. And somewhere in the shadows, maybe, the sea remembers just a little bit more than it lets on. You follow Poseidon down a dim corridor that seems to sigh with every stroke of your swim. It's the kind of hallway that feels like it should echo but doesn't, because sound here chooses to nap instead. The walls are coated in thin layers of sediment and paper-thin clamshell notes, scribbled by passing messengers and stuck up like divine post-its. As you glide along, Poseidon mutters under his breath, "Neptune better not have used glitter ink again. I'm still finding specks from last time." You finally reach a chamber that looks like a cross between a government mailroom and a very stylish coral boutique. A polished stone desk dominates the center, covered in scrolls stacked like little sedimentary layers of annoyance. Behind it stands a sea anemone with a monocle. Somehow, "Your correspondence, Lord Poseidon," it intones without looking up. Poseidon stares. "How many are from Neptune?" The anemone gestures to a separate pile bound with a starfish ribbon and very dramatic handwriting that sparkles faintly. All of these... You both approach the pile warily. Poseidon picks up the top letter, opens it, and immediately frowns. He's using calligraphy again. That means he's either upset or just got a new quill. You glance over his shoulder. The letter begins, "Dearest salty brother, once again the dolphin fleet has trespassed into the Tyrrhenian territory. This breach is not only offensive to the Roman dignity, but also Poseidon snorts. But also disruptive to the aesthetic symmetry of my jellyfish lanes." He rolls his eyes. I swear he makes this up. Another letter reads, "Furthermore, your eels have been seen curling into offensive shapes near my seahorse guards. I demand a formal apology and perhaps a pie." Poseidon taps the scroll. Neptune's diplomacy always ends in pie. According to fragments recovered from the Aquae Antiqua Codex, the rivalry between Poseidon and Neptune wasn't born of malice, but bureaucracy. When Rome annexed the Greek pantheon, everyone expected smooth divine integration. It wasn't. Historians still argue whether their overlapping sea jurisdiction was a mythological metaphor or just the result of poor celestial zoning. You open a third letter, which contains nothing but a single word written in shimmering ink. Why? Poseidon folds it neatly and places it atop a separate pile labelled Emotional Rhetoric. He shrugs. He gets moody when the Adriatic storms don't go his way. At the far end of the chamber is an old coral console with several tide charts pinned to it and a seashell phone that looks permanently off the hook. Poseidon reaches for a weathered scroll tube labelled Re, Sea Cucumber, Incident, and sighs dramatically. "That was not my fault," he says to no one. "They wandered." A scroll from Athena sits to the side, unopened. "You going to read it?" you ask. Poseidon grunts. "Later. She's usually right, and I'm not in the mood to be corrected gently today." In one corner of the chamber is a very dusty, very ornate box labelled Olympian Inbox. Do not open without snacks. You peer inside. A single letter rests there, ancient and brittle. It's from Zeus. Poseidon waves it away. He writes in thunder metaphors. It's exhausting. The clouds weep for your silence. Please. You sit on a ledge as Poseidon sifts through the rest of the letters, occasionally responding aloud with muttered retorts. "No, Neptune, dolphins are not property." "No, Neptune, a formal complaint isn't just shouting at a clam." "No, I will not send trident selfies in return." Eventually he pulls out a blank scroll and begins to write. The ink glows as he scratches out a reply, muttering, "Dear Neptune, I appreciate your enthusiasm for boundaries. However flexible your understanding of geography may be, the dolphins will continue their migrations as agreed upon in the Treaty of Sardine Shoals. Regarding the jellyfish, they have confirmed no intentional offence was made, although one may have pulsed suggestively. Enclosed is a pie. It's sea salt fig. Don't eat it all at once. Warm currants. P." He seals it with a barnacle stamp and hands it to a waiting dolphin courier, who spins dramatically and vanishes with a sparkle. Poseidon collapses into a kelp chair. "Diplomacy?" he sighs. "Even under sea, it's mostly egos and snacks." You nod. At least it's polite." He groans. "Last week, Neptune sent me a bottle of vinegar labelled Your Attitude." According to one papyrus scrap archived in Alexandria's lesser-known Hall of Unverified Mythical Grievances, Neptune once tried to poach a coral reef by offering Poseidon's fish stock better algae benefits. The reef, reportedly, responded by floating slightly farther south. You both sit in silence, the chamber swaying gently with the tides. Outside the coral windows, a school of fish spells out something rude in cursive. Poseidon pretends not to see it. Eventually, he stands. "Enough letters. I need to remind the mermaids about their clam quotas." You raise an eyebrow. "They still have quotas." He nods gravely. "They cheat. Always have. They hide pearls in their hair." As you float beside him, past the anemone who's now napping over the inbox, Poseidon glances back at the letter pile and mutters, "I should probably invite Neptune to tea again. He gets less passive-aggressive after sugar." You can't help but smile, because even sea gods, with all their power, bureaucracy and tidal spreadsheets, sometimes just need a pie and a bit of validation. You find the mermaid village precisely where Poseidon said it would be, tucked into a coral inlet that curls like a seashell and glimmers with faint echoes of pop music. Yes, underwater pop music. Apparently mermaids invented it long before humans did, but gave up when they realized conch shell distribution had limited range and sea urchins are terrible at A&R. The water here sparkles with loose bits of glitter algae, and the air, well, the vibe, smells like salted citrus, and whatever perfume comes from brushing your hair 1,000 times with a pearl-handled comb. Mermaids lounge on coral balconies, flipping their tails lazily, painting shells, and arguing over who borrowed whose pearl earrings without returning them. Poseidon slows his pace. Be polite, they've unionized. You pass under an arch made of braided seagrass and scallop fans. A sign above it reads, "Welcome to Serenia Shores, clams by appointment only." The first mermaid who spots you waves with a sequined fin and yells, "Hey, it's the tide guy!" Poseidon nods, majestic and weary. "Ladies!" They gather quickly, hair braided, unbraided, and rebraided as they swim. One wears kelp eyeliner, another is carrying a basket full of sea cucumbers that, frankly, look scandalized. A third twirls an abalone parasol and asks, "So you're here about the clam situation?" "Yes," Poseidon says, "and before you object, we're just doing a routine check. Not an audit, not a fine, just an inventory." The mermaids groan in a musical key that causes nearby coral to sulk slightly. One mermaid, Lyra, swims forward. She's got that vibe of someone who's organized every community bake-off and secretly kept the receipts. "We're not hoarding," she says flatly. "We just have aesthetic preferences." Poseidon raises an eyebrow. "You buried 172 clams in a decorative formation shaped like my trident." Lyra shrugs. It matched the tide rugs. You watch as Poseidon pulls a scroll from his pouch, neatly labeled Clam Tracking Initiative, and gently lays it out on a sponge that stiffens into a temporary desk. "Technically," he murmurs, "every citizen of the sea is allotted no more than 15 clams per equinox." A nearby mermaid gasps. "That's offensive. What about legacy clams, heirloom clams, emotional support clams?" Poseidon glances at you like, "This is every single time." According to the Code of Shell Allocation, drafted during the mid-tide compromise of the 5th century BCE, merfolk were granted partial jurisdiction over ornamental shell use. But the clause about hoarding remains interpretive. Historians still argue whether the entire treaty was meant literally or was just metaphor for control over storytelling. One academic famously wrote, "The clam is both currency and confession." Poseidon pinches the bridge of his nose. "Fine," he says. "Let's compromise. We'll count only the functional clams." The mermaids cheer, loudly and in harmony. It sounds like the climax of a musical no one rehearsed for. You're given a clipboard and assigned a small team, Coral, Misty, and Echo. They immediately hand you glitter pens, a complimentary tail charm, you don't have a tail, but they're inclusive, and a printed list titled Clams with Names, Please Don't Touch. The inspection begins. There's a spa where clams are used as heated massage stones, a meditation grotto with a clam-based sound bath, very soothing, a 3-tiered clam shelf that turns out to be entirely decorative, but emotionally significant. At one point you stumble upon a clam nursery. Tiny baby clams squeak faintly and try to chew your clipboard. Poseidon leans in, delighted. "I think your lunch." Echo pats one. "This one's named Bartholomew." You return to the central plaza after 3 circuits and several lectures on the importance of pearl storage humidity. Poseidon has set up a tiny desk and is sipping tea brewed from dried kelp and coral blossom. "Well?" he asks. You hand over the log. He skims it, then sighs. "You technically meet the guidelines, but barely. You're 2 clams over the seasonal limit. Lyra gasps. What? Where? Poseidon turns the scroll toward her. Here, under emergency clams. Lyra folds her arms. Those are emotional support clams. Poseidon sighs. Fine, I'll allow it this once. A cheer rises. Someone throws glitter kelp. Poseidon pretends to hate it. You sit on a shell-shaped bench while the mermaids begin to prepare for their post-inspection celebration, because of course they throw a party every time someone checks their storage units. Misty swims by and hands you a drink in a sea coconut shell. It fizzes faintly and tastes like sunlight on a salt rock. We do appreciate you coming down here, she says, even if the clam quotas are arbitrary and deeply offensive. Poseidon chuckles. It's the only system that works when everything's soft and slippery. She raises her shell. To the ocean's least terrifying god! Oi, Poseidon mutters. I can still summon a kraken. She grins. But would you? He doesn't answer. Just takes another sip. The music starts, something with harp snail chords and rhythmic crab percussion. The mermaids dance in spirals, their tails catching the bioluminescent light like liquid gemstones. It's hypnotic, joyful, not performative, not mythic, just alive. Poseidon watches them and leans toward you. They'll outlast us all, you know. You nod, and for a moment the ocean feels young again. The mermaid party carries on well into what Poseidon calls the twilight tides, which is sea god speak for whenever everyone's too full to dance, but too awake to leave. You eventually drift away from the clinking of shell cups and the dazzling tail spins, following Poseidon as he hums an old sea shanty that's at least 800 years out of style. So, he says, casually, slapping glitter off his shoulder, fancy something a bit more athletic? You glance sideways. Define athletic. He grins. The Undersea Olympics are holding their semi-century qualifiers. The crabs are cheating again. It's adorable. Of course they are. You glide toward an open trench lined with columns made from whale vertebrae and scallop banners flapping in the gentle currents. Bioluminescent jellyfish float overhead like stadium lights, casting a soft glow over an arena shaped like a giant sand dollar. Welcome, Poseidon says, arms wide, to the most competitive, least organized sports event in the known ocean. The stands are packed with spectators, sea slugs wearing team flags, dolphins holding noisemakers in their mouths, octopuses painting their tentacles in support of Team Sponge, and one very judgmental sea turtle with the whistle. A hermit crab in a referee vest scuttles forward. Lord Poseidon! Excellent timing! We're just about to start the crab sprint. Poseidon raises an eyebrow. You check their claws for boosters this time? The crab sighs. We tried. They used algae decals to fake out the sensors. You and Poseidon take seats carved from coral, soft and ridged like old memory foam. Below, the athletes gather in the central trench. The crab sprinters line up first, shells polished, claws gleaming, expressions that say, we definitely don't have rocket barnacles taped to our legs. The whistle blows, and they're off. Well, some of them. One trips immediately, flips sideways, and begins shouting something about slippery sand conspiracy. Another seems to run in reverse. Two zoom forward at an almost suspicious speed, leaving trails of kicked-up sediment that spell out, not cheating. Poseidon watches, amused. Crabs always overdo it. According to faded amphora art found in the sunken ruins of Anthedon, early Greek myths hinted at divine sea games, contests of grace, strength, and occasionally who can burrow into a sponge the fastest. Historians still argue whether these depictions were real rituals or just propaganda drawn by bored sailors. The next event is the synchronized squid swim. A group of squid pirouette in perfect formation, releasing carefully timed ink clouds that form geometric patterns, a starfish, a spiral, and finally Poseidon's profile, though the nose is questionable. That one's a suck-up, he says, pointing. A panel of judges composed of a narwhal, a pufferfish, and a very serious anemone holds up their scores, 9.5, 9.2, and one mysterious glyph that may or may not mean needs more tentacle drama. Then comes the sponge lift. A pair of sea cucumbers attempt to hoist a soaked sponge the size of a baby seal. They grunt. They wobble. One of them lets out a high-pitched squeak and collapses dramatically. Poseidon leans over. Sponge events are all about the internal core. Next up, the freestyle coral obstacle dash. You watch as contestants, an enthusiastic dolphin, 2 eager lobsters, and a confused-looking seahorse, leap, twist, and squeeze their way through a course of narrow reef passages and dangling seaweed ropes. The dolphin wins easily, the lobsters argue about course rules. The seahorse somehow ends up in the refreshment tent. Poseidon claps politely. Not bad, though. I once saw a manta ray limbo under a sea arch. That was peak athleticism. As the games continue, a trio of jellyfish perform ribbon dancing with trailing tendrils, glowing in time with a harp snail quartet. The audience sways. Someone hands out shell-shaped snacks. A group of barnacles in the back begins a slow chant, "Go, oh, 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 bubbles!" You turn to Poseidon. "Why do you fund this?" He smiles faintly. Because they care, they try. Even when the rules are made up and the prizes are a golden kelp trophy and bragging rights. He nods toward the center of the arena, where the closing relay begins, an all-species dash that quickly devolves into joyful chaos. Octopuses high-five each other mid-swim. A sponge gets carried over the finish line by cheering sea urchins. A shrimp waves the victory flag despite having participated in 0 events. It doesn't matter who wins. No one remembers by the end anyway. Poseidon leans back. Olympus never understood this kind of celebration. Up there, victory's about dominance. Down here, it's about laughter and glitter and a sea slug doing somersaults in a ribbon sash. You watch as the crowd spills onto the field. A spontaneous dance party begins. Sea stars lock arms. Dolphins spin in synchronized spirals. Even the crab referees join in, tossing their whistles and breakdancing sideways. Poseidon chuckles. We may not get songs written about us anymore, but you can't beat a community that throws a party after a sponge falls over. You stay a while longer, snacking on kelp puffs and sipping crushed coral nectar, watching a jellyfish teach a pufferfish how to moonwalk. Badly. Eventually Poseidon stands, brushing sand from his shoulders. Let's visit the temple vaults tomorrow. Some of the artifacts are starting to mutter. You blink. Mutter? He grins. Old relics. They get chatty after a few centuries. You rise together, letting the music and laughter trail behind you like warm current. And as you leave the glowing arena, Poseidon glances back once, softly. They'll remember this, he says, even if no scroll writes it down. The following tide begins with a door that shouldn't open. It's round, barnacle-covered, and set into the side of the palace, where the stone looks older, darker, like it's spent too long remembering things. There's no sign, no inscription, just a faint hum in the water and a sense that whatever lies beyond hasn't been dusted since Atlantis still paid rent. Poseidon floats beside you, arms crossed. This, he says with a certain reverence, is the vault. You nod slowly. He pauses. Not the vault, he clarifies. Just a vault. The dramatic one is 2 levels down, behind a singing oyster and a perpetually offended sea snake. Naturally. With a wave of his hand and a reluctant sigh from the door itself, the circle creaks open, revealing a chamber. Beyond that glows faintly with old light and older memories. You step inside. It's cool. Not cold, just that quiet temperature of still water and time standing politely in the corner. The room is round, lined with alcoves. Each contains a relic, some glowing, some muttering softly to themselves, some just sitting there looking mysterious and mildly annoyed at being ignored for so long. Poseidon floats past a pile of oyster crowns, stacked like pancakes. Those were offerings. Every coastal kingdom wanted to be the chosen tide. Most just ended up with soggy hats. He gestures toward a bronze bowl inscribed with strange runes. That used to predict storms. Then it started predicting breakups. No idea why. You peer into an alcove, holding a conch shell larger than your head. Inside, a muffled voice repeats the phrase, "Poseidon rules the brine, Poseidon rules the brine," over and over like a very salty mantra. He winces. Yeah, that one's stuck in loop. Triton made it during his affirmations phase. Further in, you find something even stranger, a bundle of seagrass tied with red coral string. It doesn't glow, it doesn't mutter, it just sits there like a very quiet regret. Poseidon approaches slowly. That was hers? You look up. He doesn't elaborate. Instead, he lifts it gently and says, "Amphitrite used to braid these for luck. Left this one before she left." You nod, not pressing. According to scattered fragments from ancient poets, mostly ignored or dismissed as romantic embellishments, Poseidon's consort left the sea realm not in anger but in silence. Historians still argue whether she vanished into a deeper trench or simply walked out of myth entirely. Poseidon replaces the braid and moves on. You reach a case holding a cracked mirror framed in abalone and sea silver. "It showed your true face," he murmurs, "until it got overwhelmed. Now it just shows everyone as a confused oyster." You check. He's not kidding. To your left, a rusted trident tip floats within a water-sealed jar, spinning slowly. You ask what happened to the rest. "I lost it in a duel with a sea lion," Poseidon says flatly. He cheated. Next is a dusty parchment that tries to roll itself up every time you look at it. Poseidon catches it mid-roll and reads aloud. "Proposed edicts for tide control, revised draft 203, no tidal waves during naps. Salinity adjustments must be approved by at least 2 sentient sponges." He tosses it aside. Bureaucracy got out of hand during the Middle Sea period. You continue toward the final alcove. It's covered in shimmering strands of eel silk and sealed with a bubble lock. Inside floats a single item, a stone carving of Poseidon, young, laughing, wild-eyed, one arm around a dolphin, the other raised mid-toast. You look at him. He looks away. "That was before," he says. "Before what?" you ask gently. He takes a moment. "Before the noise, before the responsibility, before people started needing me more than knowing me." He stares at the carving, then chuckles softly. "I liked that dolphin. Terrible sense of direction, but great at jokes." The silence in the vault grows thicker. Not heavy, just thoughtful. Poseidon exhales, a ripple passing across the room. "Sometimes," he says, "gods keep things not to remember, but to see if they still feel anything when they do." You nod, and then, because the room seems to require it, you sit. Just you, Poseidon, and several mildly sentient relics humming lullabies to themselves. You sit in silence long enough to hear the heartbeat of the palace. A low, steady thump, faint, patient, like the sea itself is listening in. Eventually, Poseidon stands and stretches. "Well, that was enough nostalgia for one era. Let's go somewhere absolutely ridiculous." You blink. "Like where?" He grins. "The courtroom." You raise an eyebrow. "The clam courtroom," he clarifies, obviously. You follow him out, passing one last relic, a music box shaped like a squid. It plays only one song. It's off-key, but Poseidon still taps his fingers in time as the door closes behind you. You make your way through the palace's west wing, which, according to Poseidon, is where the logic goes to take a nap. It's a less trafficked area, mostly used for low-stakes arbitration, sea creature licensing renewals, and, of course, clam-related legal disputes. As you approach the courtroom, the water around you grows noticeably more solemn. Coral pillars rise around a central amphitheatre like curled fingers, and the entry arch bears a shell-carved motto, "Let the bivalve be heard." Poseidon sighs as you pass beneath it. They insisted on that inscription, had it approved by a council of mollusks. Inside, the chamber hums with a bureaucratic energy that feels damp. The gallery seats are filled with various sea creatures whispering to each other in polite outrage. Jellyfish float silently in the back row like impartial observers. A squid bailiff stands near the entrance, holding a trident with all the authority of a stressed intern. "Ah," Poseidon says, "we're just in time for the opening arguments." The case? Clam? Sponge, an age-old dispute. At the centre of the room sits the plaintiff, a rather cranky clam in a tailored seagrass suit, clicking its shell irritably. Opposite it floats the defendant, a sponge with dark circles under its paws. It looks like it's been through several legal systems and is not emotionally prepared for another. The judge, a stern sea urchin named Magistrate Prickleford, bangs a gavel made from reinforced coral. His court is now in session. The matter before us, unauthorised squatting on private shell property. The clam opens its shell dramatically. "Your Honour, this sponge has lived inside me for 32 tides without paying rent, contributing to algae maintenance, or respecting the clam-to-pearl boundary clause." The sponge replies in a slow, absorbent drawl. "Your Honour, I was told the clam was zoned for communal symbiosis. Also, I bring emotional warmth." Poseidon leans over to whisper, "He used to be a poet. You can tell by the way he weaponizes metaphors." The courtroom listens as an eel lawyer, yes, eel lawyer, slides forward and presents precedent scrolls, including Shell vs. Coral Reef and Barnacle vs. the People. According to obscure lines in the legal codex of Nautilon, the clam courtroom was once merely symbolic, a performative ritual to reinforce social cohesion among benthic communities. But sometime in the 3rd century BCE, a crab declared a mistrial over shell decor, and the entire system spiraled into legitimacy. Historians still argue whether the clam court has ever actually resolved anything. "Exhibit A," the clam says, pushing forward a blown-up painting of the sponge sleeping. "Unapproved naps." "Exhibit B," the sponge counters, "a poem I wrote about the clam's inner glow." The poem is titled "Ode to My Shellmate." It's not great. Magistrate Prickleford sighs. "Enough exhibits. Do either of you have actual witnesses?" There's a shuffle. And suddenly, much to everyone's surprise, Poseidon floats forward. He's not required to. He's not on the docket. But he raises one hand and says, "I'd like to speak for the court." Gasps echo. A hermit crab drops its monocle. The magistrate nods. "Permission granted, Lord of the Sea." Poseidon floats to the centre and turns slowly to address the room. "We are gathered here today because a clam feels taken advantage of, and a sponge feels unseen. And frankly, I get it." He gestures broadly. "I've been both. I've had temples I didn't ask for, and offerings I didn't want. I've hosted oracles who demanded visions while clogging my drains. I've been squatted in, emotionally, metaphorically, sometimes literally." There's a beat of silence. Then Poseidon continues. "But the ocean," he says, voice softening, "is not made of clean lines and tidy boundaries. It's made of drift, of overlap, of things that end up in each other's space because the current said so. That's not failure, that's just coexistence." The jellyfish gallery glows in appreciation. He turns to the clam and the sponge. "What if, just for a tide or two, you tried being neighbours instead of plaintiffs?" The clam blinks. The sponge ripples. Magistrate Prickleford sighs. "This is highly irregular, but oddly persuasive." A brief recess is called. You and Poseidon sit on a coral bench as the two litigants float off to the mediation pool, literally just a warm, bubbly corner where disputing parties soak and sulk. Poseidon leans back. "You know, I used to dread these court days, but there's something comforting about watching creatures care this much about shared space." You glance at a nearby parchment tacked to the wall. It reads, "Justice flows even sideways." Later, a sea snail assistant hands out tiny certificates that read, "I served in Clam Court, and all I got was perspective. You keep yours. It's gold-trimmed and slightly sticky." As you float away from the courtroom, Poseidon hums again, soft, thoughtful, something between a lullaby and a closing argument. "That sponge is going to write another poem," he mutters. You grin. "Think it'll be any better?" No, he says, but the effort matters. And in the depths of the sea, where clams soothe sponges and sea urchins wear robes of authority, you begin to understand the gentler truths of divine life, that even gods must arbitrate nonsense, and sometimes the best wisdom comes from creatures with no voice, only intention. After the courtroom adjourns and the sponge leaves with a renewed sense of poetic destiny, you follow Poseidon through a quieter wing of the palace. The walls here are lined with mosaics not of battles or temples, but of peculiar creatures. Some mythological, others just odd. A lion with gills, a turtle with what looks like a harp for a shell, a fish with eyes on the inside. Time, Poseidon says, to meet my mythical pets, or as I call them, my less marketable legends. The hallway opens into a large sunken garden, draped in curling kelp and softly bubbling vents. It's quieter than the rest of the palace. Still. Sacred, in its own goofy way. Poseidon whistles, a sound more like a gurgle mixed with a kazoo. And suddenly the stillness breaks. From behind a mossy coral arch, a soggy griffin pads into view. Yes, a griffin, but wetter. Its wings are slightly wilted from the damp, and its feathers have a habit of sticking together like overcooked spaghetti. It looks at you, sneezes. A small fish flies out of its beak. "This is Gribble," Poseidon says proudly. "The aquagriff, flightless, fearless, frequently confused." Gribble walks up to you and sits, with some difficulty. You scratch behind its ears, soft, kelpy ears, and it lets out a low, bubbling purr. Next, a pair of sea serpents slither out from beneath a rock arch. They're tiny, no bigger than sardines, and each wears a little coral helmet that's clearly for morale, not function. "They're twin kelp worms," Poseidon says. "I named them Deborah and also Deborah. Don't ask." You watch as one Deborah chases her tail in a slow, dizzy circle. The other Deborah weaves through a patch of seaweed, pretending it's a labyrinth. "Highly symbolic," Poseidon whispers, "if you're very patient." Then comes a jelly dog, something between a jellyfish and a golden retriever. It bounds up to you in slow motion, tentacles flapping like a wet ribbon in a gentle breeze. It tries to bark. It gurgles. Poseidon tosses it a ball made of packed sand and shell fragments. It catches it with two flippers and dissolves halfway from excitement before reforming proudly. "His name is Bartleby," Poseidon says. "He's made of love and zero structure." You can't stop smiling. Next to a shell fountain, you spot what looks like a lump of moss until it blinks. "That's Harold," Poseidon says. Well, we're not actually sure what he is. Might be a larval leviathan, might be a fern. Either way, he's a great listener. Harold makes a sound like someone sighing into pudding. You wander the garden, each step revealing another curious inhabitant. A hermit kraken in a teacup-sized cave, a fish with one fin and an attitude, a manta ray with an obsession for synchronized swimming, who tries to teach you a routine you will never, ever master. Poseidon walks slowly beside you. "These creatures," he says, "don't get statues. No epics, but they're mine. Or maybe I'm theirs." You sit on a smooth patch of coral shaped like a beanbag, and one of the Deborah curls beside you, coiling into a tiny ring and falling asleep in seconds. "You created them?" you ask. Poseidon shrugs. "Some of them, some just happened. You toss a myth into the sea, it mutates. Mix it with moonlight, loneliness, and a pinch of weird plankton, and you get a Bartleby." He tosses another sandball. Bartleby chases it, gets distracted by a bubble, and forgets what he was doing halfway. "Humans wanted me to create chariots and storms," Poseidon continues. "But sometimes I just wanted to make something that could nap in my lap." He picks up a comb made of shell and starts brushing Gribble's soggy feathers. He used to molt in reverse, shed feathers back onto himself. Very confusing. According to the fragments of the Critic and Bestiary, a banned 6th century compilation written by a hermit who claimed to live in a sponge for 7 years, Poseidon was said to have kept tide-tamed beasts that were too strange for Olympian gatherings. One quote reads how they sang only at dusk and danced in their dreams while the sea forgot how to be angry. Scholars still debate whether this passage refers to actual animals or Poseidon's moods. You lay back, watching the sea filter sunlight through gentle waves. The garden sways around you like a lullaby. Somewhere nearby, also Deborah sneezes and knocks over a pebble tower. Poseidon laughs softly. "They're not perfect," he says, "but that's what makes them mine." You ask why he keeps them hidden. "I don't hide them," he says, brushing a bit of algae off his robe. "I just don't parade them. Olympus likes spectacle. They're for peace." He pauses. Sometimes the sea needs to be more than power and depth. It needs to be weird, gentle, kind of squishy. Bartleby settles at your feet. Gribble yawns a bubble. Harold hums. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the coral and the rhythm of the slow tides fill your chest. These aren't the beasts of legend, they're better. By the time you leave the mythical pet garden, you've collected several. Aerial clingy tentacle hugs, a soggy feather, and an unsolicited poem from Harold that somehow manifested in your pocket. Poseidon chuckles as he seals the kelp-laced gate behind you. "They'll be quiet now," he says. "It's nearly census time." You blink. "You mean like a population census?" "Exactly," he replies, "but for crustaceans it's a whole thing." He waves you along a twisting passage filled with clicking sounds, soft, sharp, rhythmic, and increasingly coordinated. As you round a coral archway, the scene opens before you like a bureaucratic carnival. Crabs of every size, colour, and temperament scuttle in organised chaos around an open plaza, carved into a coral shelf. Stalls have been set up, one for registration, one for claw measurements, one labelled lefty or righty, circle 1. Above it all hangs a floating banner of bubble letters, Crustacean Census Day. Every claw counts. You stare. Poseidon sighs with fond exhaustion. It started as a logistics thing, but then the barnacles unionized. You're handed a clipboard by a barnacle wearing tiny reading glasses and an aggressive hat. Are you a counter or a verifier? "Verifier," Poseidon answers for you. The barnacle squints. "Good. Counters are stressed today." You make your way into the crowd, dodging a horde of sprinting fiddler crabs engaged in a heated argument about regional shell sizes. At the identity station, a hermit crab is being questioned about whether it's the same individual who registered last cycle. "I've had shell work done," it says defensively. "That doesn't make me someone else." Near the stage, a lobster with a clipboard is reciting names in a tone of increasing despair. "Clarence, Clicky, Christopher, Crabby, Crabby Jr., Crabby the Third." "No, I already said you." Poseidon leans in. They're always triple counted. Families get enthusiastic. You observe a census counter trying to tally a particularly jittery cluster of sand crabs who keep burrowing halfway through the process. Eventually, the counter throws down their pen and shouts, "I need a jellyfish decoy! Somebody call Larry!" A jellyfish floats in and hovers menacingly. The crabs freeze. Counting resumes. It's impressive in a way, meticulously absurd. According to the rarely studied Scrolls of Seafloor Society, crustaceans have held formal censuses since the time of the Pelagian tides, when Poseidon first declared, "Let all things with shells be known." The initiative was meant to track population surges after a series of celebratory moltings. Historians still argue whether the census was divine bookkeeping or just an elaborate excuse to throw a festival involving plankton cupcakes. At a booth labelled Demographic Questions, a blue crab answers with excessive flair, "Yes, I identify as a crustacean. No, I do not wish to be sorted by shell gloss. I prefer to be addressed as exoskeletal luminary first class." Poseidon smiles. They take self-image very seriously. At one point, a decapod census protest breaks out. A group of disgruntled barnacles waves tiny placards. "We exist too! Don't count us out." Barnacle is not a derogatory term. Poseidon floats over, raises his hands, and calmly says, "Everyone gets counted. even the clingy ones. The barnacles cheer and promptly resume clinging. You help Poseidon check a few booths, one dedicated solely to verifying molting anniversaries. A hermit crab bursts into tears of joy when Poseidon signs its 100th shell day certificate. Elsewhere, a pair of teenage prawns fake their ages to qualify for early pearl benefits. They're politely caught and assigned to the maturity counselling pool, supervised by a very bored-looking sea slug. Near the census headquarters, you spot a mural painted by some enterprising urchins. It features Poseidon holding a scroll in one hand and cradling a crab in the other, beneath a rainbow of seaweed confetti. The caption reads, "One God, infinite claws." Poseidon winces. Not exactly my catchphrase, but it tested well with the arthropod demographic. You take a break on a sponge bench, nibbling on a census snack, a kelp cracker shaped like a lobster. Poseidon joins you, reading over the tally scrolls. "You wouldn't believe how competitive it gets," he says. "Some regions inflate their numbers just to qualify for extra plankton grants." You raise an eyebrow. "So, crustacean politics?" "Oh yes," he says. "They even redrew the reef lines last cycle, a huge fight, very dramatic, ended in a dance-off." You're about to ask more when a messenger shrimp zips up with the final tally. Poseidon opens it, glances over the numbers and smiles. "Stable population, 3 new hybrids, 1 accidental sponge registration. That's a good year." He rolls up the scroll and hands it back with a nod. The shrimp bows and jets away. The sun, filtered through waves and plankton, casts long lines of golden blue across the census plaza. Crabs laugh, lobsters dance, barnacles hug, with limited enthusiasm. A fiddler crab plays a tiny harp made of driftwood. You watch it all and ask, why keep doing this? Why go through all the trouble? Poseidon leans back. Because they want to be seen, counted, remembered, not for glory or power, just to know they matter. He watches a young crab practicing its signature for the first time. "They live short lives," he adds, "but every one of them fills the sea with something, a click, a ripple, a dance. Doesn't that deserve to be written down?" You nod, and in that moment you understand. Beneath all the myths, the monsters, and the marble statues of Poseidon flexing dramatically, there's this: quiet stewardship, gentle cataloguing, a god who doesn't just rule the ocean but remembers it. Poseidon stretches his back, and several ancient vertebrae make a sound like a kelp curtain being crumpled. "We've earned a break," he says. "Let's go to karaoke." You blink. "Karaoke?" He grins. "Oh, absolutely. Siren karaoke night, weekly, judged harshly. There are costumes." You're not sure if he's joking until you arrive. The venue is built into the side of a reef, shaped like a crescent moon, lit by glowing plankton and ringed with coral seating carved into dramatic swoops. A neon jellyfish sign flickers above the arch, the gilded gill, open mic, open hearts, closed fins. Please you, step inside, and the vibe changes instantly. The lighting is sultry purple. A faint current carries the scent of sea grapes and krill cocktails. At the center of the room is a raised stage made from the polished remains of a shipwreck's dining table. A narwhal in a glitter cape MCs from behind a clamshell podium. "Welcome, lovers of lyrical longing," it bellows. A few sea cucumbers faint with excitement. Poseidon gives the room a polite wave and is instantly mobbed by a group of sirens in sequined sargassum wraps. "He's here!" one shrieks. "The original Deep Note himself?" Poseidon leans over to you. "They always forget I'm tone deaf. Prepare to suffer." You're ushered to a plush sponge booth, and drinks are brought, kelp fizz in chilled coral cups. You sip cautiously. It tastes like someone blended mint and melancholy. The performances begin. First up is a trio of sirens singing a soulful rendition of "Don't Go Breaking My Reef." The harmonies are otherworldly, the eye contact intense. One of them cries mid-verse, and 2 octopuses begin slow dancing in response. Next comes a solo dolphin belting "Total Eclipse of the Tide," followed by a nervous sea lion doing a passionate, off-key cover of "Whale Always Love You." Then Poseidon is called to the stage. A hush falls. He grumbles. Fine, let me embarrass myself in peace. He steps up, selects a track, and clears his throat. The instrumental begins, a slow, dramatic sea ballad, something old, reverent, in an entirely offbeat rhythm. He sings, it's terrible, gloriously terrible, off-key, emotionally unhinged, and yet somehow stirring, like listening to a seasick prophet. He commits, he gestures, he reaches out toward the ceiling with theatrical agony. When he hits the high note, the lights flicker and a jellyfish explodes. The sirens go wild. Someone throws a pearl onto the stage. The narwhal weeps silently. You lean over to a crab waiter. Is this normal? The crab nods solemnly. We live for it. According to a scrap from the Scroll of Forgotten Festivals, siren karaoke was once a sacred rite performed at moon-high tides to honor the sea's emotional undercurrents. Over time, it evolved into competitive performance art, complete with secret rankings, fan clubs, and one infamous year where a sponge won by humming through its pores. Historians still argue whether the original rituals were about catharsis or simply an excuse to outsing your enemies. Poseidon returns to the booth, flushed and satisfied. That, he says, collapsing into the sponge cushion, was therapeutic. You nod. The jellyfish exploded. He holds up a coral-stamped drink. That means I hit the note. The next performer is a young siren with nervous eyes and a voice so clear it slices through the water like glass. She sings a lullaby, something ancient, in a dialect even Poseidon closes his eyes to understand. You feel the room go still. The lyrics speak of shipwrecked sailors, of coral that remembers footsteps, of tides that carry heartbreak like sea foam. No one claps, no one needs to. When she finishes, the lights dim in soft respect. Poseidon wipes his eye. Okay, maybe 2 jellyfish exploded. As the night continues, the songs grow stranger. One trio of fish sings a ska anthem using bubble beats. A duo of eels performs I Want to Kelp You Heal. A sea sponge offers interpretive hums which receive a standing ovation. Poseidon leans in. They say karaoke is frivolous, but sometimes the sea needs a place to sing badly about things it doesn't understand. You ask if he's always come here. He shakes his head. Only when Olympus gets too loud. There's something about a room where no one wants anything from me but a terrible solo. You sip your drink. It's comforting. He nods. Exactly. A final performer takes the stage, a tiny shrimp with stage fright who squeaks their way through Let It Flow. The room cheers them like royalty. Poseidon raises his glass. To bravery in strange forms. You clink your coral cups and sit in the purple glow quiet, the hum of the sea turning soft and slow. As you leave the gilded gill, the lights shimmer a goodbye and the narwhal MC hands Poseidon a trophy shaped like a broken harp. Most dramatic interpretation, it reads. Poseidon tucks it under his arm. I'm putting this in the vault. The next tide arrives slowly, with a curtain of lazy bubbles and the faint echo of Poseidon still humming last night's closing chorus. Tide will always love you. You're not sure how long he's been awake, but the glitter from karaoke night is still in his beard. He stretches, then waves a finger toward a shaded alcove. Come on, he says, let's go somewhere ridiculous. You smile. More ridiculous than explosive jellyfish karaoke? He grins. Welcome to Atlantis, or what's left of it. You follow him through a long kelp tunnel, one that grows darker and quieter with each turn, until the only sounds are your own movements and the gentle creak of ancient pressure. The path ends abruptly in a cavern that yawns wide beneath the seafloor. You float to the edge and stare. Below is a ruined sprawl of buildings, half buried in coral, leaning drunkenly against the seafloor like someone tried to build a palace and gave up halfway. The signs are mismatched. The streets spiral inward like a drain. There's a collapsed temple with a banner still fluttering across the front. Grand opening 5,000 years ago. Atlantis, Poseidon says, the not-so-great version. You drift down through murky blue light. Bits of fallen columns litter the roads. Fish dart through shattered windows. A crab in a crown made of chewing gum wrappers scuttles out of a bakery labelled Eclairs and Eternal Wisdom. This wasn't the glorious utopia they write about, Poseidon continues. This was Atlantis's lesser cousin. They called it New Atlantis, but it was mostly a failed mall concept. You raise an eyebrow. Atlantis Prime, he clarifies, the one people get excited about, that one sank dramatically, with statues and gold and a full-on choir. This one just folded quietly under bad zoning laws. You float through a long abandoned corridor with vending clams still stuck open. One offers expired seaweed chips and a sand dollar slot labelled exact change or barter only. You peek inside what must have been a civic centre, now filled with disgruntled groupers playing underwater chess and muttering about property taxes. A faded plaque reads, "They said the tides would never turn." They were ambitious, Poseidon murmurs. They tried to build a spiritual hub, a cultural wonder, and a food court all in one. Turned out none of them knew how plumbing worked. In the centre of the city is a plaza, once ornate, now half swallowed by sea fans and silt. A sunken statue of Poseidon leans sideways, its nose broken, its trident poking a coral reef in what can only be described as a very undignified position. He stares at it. "Didn't even ask my permission," he mutters. "Captured my worst angle." You wander into a structure labelled Atlantis Experience Centre. Inside, a looping projection of glowing plankton attempts to explain the city's original vision. A place for everyone, especially the rich. It then glitches and starts playing kelp commercials. According to a mostly forgotten text called the Blue Scrolls of Solon, Atlantis may have had multiple iterations, some advanced, others hastily constructed. Historians still argue whether the more pedestrian versions were real or just later spin-offs made by dreamers with too much ambition and not enough waterproof cement. Poseidon points out a broken escalator, its steps tangled with barnacles. They tried to make vertical shell elevators, too noisy, scared the octopuses. A group of elderly sea slugs lounges nearby, playing bingo with pearl tokens. One of them squints at you and mutters, "Tourists again?" You pass a bookstore filled with soggy scrolls titled things like "Manifest Your Inner Dolphin" and "The One Trident Diet." Poseidon holds up one with a smirk. This one blamed salt water for aging. You glance at the cover. Is that you on the front? He winces. Heavily edited. In the amphitheatre, a lone sea turtle gives an impassioned one-man show to an audience of 2 clams. Poseidon listens for a moment, then nods approvingly. Still better than most plays on Olympus. You drift into the residential district, rows of coral condos, most long abandoned. Some still hold signs that read "Fully Submerged Luxury Living" and "Gated Kelp Community." One has a faded welcome mat that says "Tides in, shoes off." Poseidon stops beside a rusted mailbox and sighs. They dreamed so big, but they forgot the ocean doesn't stay still. You float in silence, watching as a manta ray slowly glides past, trailing streamers from what must have been an ancient holiday celebration. Behind it, a sunken billboard declares in cracked shell tiles, "Atlantis, tomorrow's myth today." Poseidon chuckles. Well, at least they got that part right. You wander back toward the centre, past an abandoned smoothie bar and a shrine filled with mouldy statues of local deities that Poseidon swears he's never met. One is labelled Barry, Lord of Bubbles. "That's just a clam with a wig," he says, flatly. As you rise from the ruins, the city fades beneath you like a memory, trying too hard to impress. Above, the water grows clearer, lighter. The hum of the palace calls faintly from beyond the kelp. Poseidon pauses at the edge of the trench. "I visit once every century," he says quietly, "to remind myself that not every myth begins beautifully. Some start with malls and bad plumbing, but even those had hope." He glances back once. "They built it with love, with flaws, with too many trident statues, but it mattered." You look down one last time, and in the stillness you agree. Even forgotten cities are part of the ocean's heartbeat. Poseidon doesn't speak for a while after leaving not-so-great Atlantis. He drifts slowly, hands behind his back, beard swirling softly in the current. You match his pace, allowing the silence to settle, a quiet tide between the absurd and the sacred. Then he clears his throat. "So," he says, suddenly chipper, "remember that whirlpool I made by accident and never turned off?" You stop mid-glide. Wait, what? He grins like a sea god trying not to laugh at his own punchline. "Come on, I'll show you." You follow him through a narrow canyon of sharp coral teeth and flickering light. The water feels heavier here, like it remembers being spun in circles one too many times. Eventually you hear it, a low, rhythmic thrum, almost like distant thunder but softer, more circular. It pulses in your chest before it reaches your ears. "Behold," Poseidon says dramatically, gesturing to an enormous underwater basin lined with spiraling trenches. At its center, the forgotten whirlpool. It spins slowly, not dangerously, just eternally. A gentle swirl of current and lazy debris orbiting a drain that no longer leads anywhere. You stare. "Is it safe?" "Oh, very," he says. "It used to be faster, but I dulled it down after someone's kelp garden got pulled in." The whirlpool sways with dignified weariness, like a retired ballerina still spinning because no one told her to stop. Stray leaves circle lazily. A single sandal spins in slow orbit. A jellyfish floats by, looking contemplative. According to the tales of the deep drift, an ancient whirlpool appeared centuries ago in the sea of reflection, rumoured to be created not by anger or war, but by divine absent-mindedness. Historians still argue whether it was a failed transport system, a lost experiment, or simply Poseidon forgetting to press off. You float closer to the edge. The current tugs gently at your fingers. Poseidon tosses in a pebble. It circles once, twice, then disappears into the swirl with a satisfied plip. He watches it like someone watching laundry spin. "I made this one day after arguing with Ares. I needed to think, so I made a vortex, as one does." You blink. "And just left it?" He shrugs. "It became kind of meditative. People used to throw offerings into it, then grocery lists, then X's seashells. Now it mostly catches seaweed flyers and bored crustaceans." He points to a bench carved into the seafloor, weathered smooth by centuries of swirling tides. "Come sit. It's oddly therapeutic." You do, it is. You sit beside Poseidon as the whirlpool hums softly. Around its edge, a handful of fish form a loose circle, drifting gently in the spin. One crab meditates, legs folded, eyes closed. "They say it grants clarity," Poseidon murmurs, "or at least dizziness, which sometimes feels like the same thing." He leans back. "Triton once tried to plug it with a boulder, got stuck. Had to send in 3 dolphins and a very persuasive eel." You glance at the whirlpool again. "Has it ever pulled you in?" "Oh, sure," he says. "In the early days, I spun for a week. Came out with sea moss in places I didn't know I had." He gestures at a sunken plaque on the floor. You brush off the silt to read, "Here swirls what cannot be fixed. Here rests what spins without purpose. Sit, forget, resume." You ask if he wrote it. He shakes his head. "No, that was Harold." "The pet?" He nods. "Deep thinker, terrible dinner guest." You both sit a while longer. The whirlpool continues, unbothered, undramatic. Doesn't suck in ships or roar with mythic power. It just moves. A quiet spiral in an ocean that rarely pauses. Poseidon throws in a memory next, a broken coral bracelet. It vanishes into the swirl without ceremony. You toss in a loose thought of your own. Something unfinished, something worth letting go. It feels good. "So many things down here just keep going," Poseidon says softly. "Not for a reason, just because no one stops them. And maybe they're not supposed to stop." He watches the whirlpool, eyes half-lidded. "I could close it, seal the flow, patch the spin, but then what?" We lose a place like this, a place that hums for no one. You nod. The water around you slows slightly as if listening. Then Poseidon stands. "Come on," he says. "I want to show you something that should have stopped but didn't." You rise and follow him past the edge of the basin, past the meditating crab and the spinning jellyfish, past the sandal that might have belonged to a demigod, or just someone in a hurry. The whirlpool spins behind you, no faster, no slower, no less forgotten, just there, doing what it does, being what it is, and for a moment, that's enough. Poseidon glides ahead now with a rare kind of purpose, not his usual lazy zigzag or casual loop, but a straight line, focused, quiet. Even the water seems to part a little differently around him. "You'll like this," he says without turning. It's philosophical and mildly ridiculous. You follow him into a wide, open grotto shaped like a hollowed-out nautilus. The walls curve inward in slow spirals, lined with seashells that hum faintly as you pass. In the center of the chamber is a circular platform made of bleached coral and sand-polished stone. Around it, seated or hovering, are sea philosophers of all types. Some are ancient sea turtles with weathered eyes. Some are squids wearing monocles. One is a manatee draped in a kelp toga, holding a scroll upside down and nodding very seriously. At the head of the circle floats a shark with a quill stuck behind its dorsal fin. "Ah," it says, "Poseidon, we're deep in the weekly debate of deep things. You've arrived late." "I brought a guest," Poseidon says, gesturing to you. The manatee leans forward. "Has the guest contemplated the nature of brine?" You shrug. "I've had soup." The shark seems satisfied. According to obscure pages from the Codex Driftus, the deep-sea philosophers' circle was formed when Poseidon grew tired of Olympus's aggressive shouting matches and wanted a quieter kind of argument, one involving more contemplation and less thunder-throwing. Historians still argue whether these debates ever influenced policy or were just Poseidon's way of tricking jellyfish into reading Plato. The topic tonight is posted above the circle in glowing plankton script. Is Poseidon the ocean, or does he simply work here? Poseidon groans. Again? The manatee raises a fin. We never reached consensus. A squid with wire-rimmed glasses pipes up. We must begin with the definition of being. Is the sea a role, a place, or an expression? A jellyfish pulses nervously. But if Poseidon is the sea, how does he also vacation from it? The shark clears its throat. Let us explore the three major schools of thought on the matter. Poseidon slouches into a sea sponge seat. This will take a while. The first school is the tide identity theorists. They argue that Poseidon is inseparable from the ocean itself, that every current, coral bloom, and fish burp is part of his divine essence. Even the plankton, you whisper. Especially the plankton. The squid nods gravely. The second school is the shifted trident school, which believes Poseidon is more like a divine contractor. He shapes the sea, manages it, but could, in theory, quit. This, Poseidon mutters, is the view most appealing to my retirement fantasies. The third school, the Wave Watcher Collective, thinks the ocean exists independently and Poseidon is merely its most frequent intern. They cite the time he lost track of high tide for 3 months and everyone just adapted. "I meant to do that," Poseidon says defensively. "It was an experiment in resilience." You lean toward him. "Which one is right?" He shrugs. "I honestly have no idea." The debate intensifies. A clam quotes Socrates. A dolphin insists on Kierkegaard. A starfish quietly argues for nihilism. But no one listens because it keeps flipping itself upside down mid-sentence. You ask Poseidon, "Does this go anywhere?" "Oh, absolutely," he replies. "After about 3 hours, someone proposes that love is also wet, and then we all go get seaweed cookies. Someone brings up the whirlpool. Someone else questions whether Poseidon made it, or if the ocean simply expressed it through him. A hermit crab yells, 'You are a metaphor,' and is gently ushered out by a coral bouncer. Poseidon chuckles. They've been debating this for 500 years, never reached consensus, but they keep showing up. You watch them argue and gesture and quote passages from long-lost texts written in scallop ink and poetic despair. The circle feels sacred not because of divine truth, but because of the effort. These creatures show up to wonder out loud, to ask questions no current can answer. Eventually, the circle dissolves into informal discussion. Someone brings snacks. The manatee offers you a piece of sea fennel pie. It's unexpectedly sweet and faintly philosophical. Poseidon takes a deep breath. "I like coming here," he says. "No one asks for storms. No one sacrifices goats. They just wonder if I'm real in the way salt is real." You nod. "Are you?" He smirks. If I said yes, I'd be arrogant. If I said no, I'd be mysterious. Better to just be present." You sit a while longer, watching the conversation drift like kelp in thought. A jellyfish asks whether the ocean dreams. A turtle proposes that Poseidon is just the ocean's favorite metaphor. You think about it. You don't need an answer. The water here is full of questions, and that's enough. As you leave, someone hands you a scroll titled The Fluid Self and Other Drifting Concepts. Poseidon rolls his eyes, but pockets it anyway. "We'll debate again next century," the shark calls. Poseidon waves. "Try to pick a new topic, or at least change the font." You leave the debate chamber, still feeling a bit like your mind is wrapped in sea foam and paradoxes. Poseidon hums beside you, content, an ancient god, oddly energized by a 3-hour argument about metaphysics led by a dolphin in reading glasses. As you swim through a softly glowing passage, he claps his hands once and says, "All that thinking's made me hungry. Let's visit the ancient sea recipe archive." You raise an eyebrow. "Sea recipe?" He nods. "Before people wrote poems, they wrote recipes. The two weren't that different, honestly. Both required salt, rhythm, and a little mystery." The archive is tucked inside a sunken spiral tower grown entirely from stacked oyster shells. A sleepy squid librarian greets you with a nod and gestures toward the back, where a large stone slab displays today's featured document. Benthic tart of seaweed and whale butter, 5th century BCE. Serves 2 humans or 14, very shy, shrimp. Poseidon taps the slab fondly. "Ah, the tart, legendary, mostly in how bad it was." He turns to the squid. "Fetch the puffer." Moments later, a puffed-up, apron-wearing pufferfish flits in, fins dusted with ground kelp and what appears to be pickled algae zest. He beams. "Aha, you're here for Recreation Day." You blink. "What's that?" Poseidon grins. "Exactly what it sounds like. We find the weirdest, oldest dish on record and try to make it edible. According to the dusty Codex Brennius, the Sea Recipe Archive was established during a calm tide era when Poseidon challenged his followers to feed the gods like the sea feeds itself. The result? Several centuries of soggy pastries, eel-based sauces, and one infamous broth that allegedly whispered secrets to the spoon. Historians still argue whether any of these dishes were meant to be consumed or just used as metaphors for social order. You follow Poseidon and the puffer into a domed test kitchen. It's full of bubbling coral pots, seaweed prep stations, and one very judgmental mussel who acts as sous chef by grunting whenever someone grabs the wrong seasoning. The recipe scroll is unrolled on a slab of polished shell. Poseidon reads aloud. Step 1. Gather the finest red seaweed from a north-facing reef under a waning moon. Rinse gently while humming a lament for lost turtles. He hums a bit. The mussel grunts. The pufferfish hums louder, and a nearby crab softly weeps. Step 2. Whale butter must be churned by 3 hermit crabs named Gregory. If unavailable, 1 named Barry will do. Poseidon shouts down a hallway. "Barry," a grumpy crab scuttles in. "I am off duty." "Your churn lead now," Poseidon replies. The crab sighs and begins spinning a churn shaped like an old amphora. You offer to help. The butter smells somewhere between nostalgia and poor decisions. Step 3. Layer red kelp, butter paste, and salt pearls into a conch mold. Sing to it once, bake near a thermal vent, then apologize. The puffer assembles it all with care, layering the ingredients like it's an underwater souffle. He hums a haunting tune about tide cycles and broken shells. You're not sure what the mould thinks, but it gurgles once in response. Poseidon adjusts the temperature dial on the thermal vent, which hisses disapprovingly. The tart is placed in a baking nook lined with polished volcanic glass. Everyone watches. The mussel crosses two shells dramatically. 20 minutes later, the tart emerges. It is lumpy, slightly twitching, smelling of fermented kelp and childhood regret. You sit down with Poseidon and the puffer at a coral table set with pearl spoons and sea sponge napkins. The tart jiggles once, ominously. Poseidon cuts a slice and winces. It's warm in the way disappointment is warm. You try it. The texture is somewhere between moss and boiled poetry. The flavour, hints of seawater, confusion, and distant flattery. The puffer beams. It's authentic, Poseidon grimaces, which is both the goal and the tragedy. A nearby octopus chef takes a bite, pauses and declares, "This would pair well with a vintage barnacle glaze and no expectations." According to a footnote in the original recipe scroll, this dish was offered to Poseidon during a drought with the hope it would convince him to send rain. The drought lasted 2 more months. Poseidon claims it was unrelated. The clouds were just offended. You finish your slice, impressed despite the taste. Poseidon leans back. You know, people always think gods want grand offerings, gold, sacrifice, eternal devotion, but sometimes I just wanted someone to try a recipe, to feed the sea, even badly. He gestures to the leftover tart, now quivering with tired dignity. This is worship too. You sit quietly, the salt of the tart still on your tongue. Not delicious, not divine, but honest. Poseidon places a slice into a conch and sends it drifting outward toward the trenches. "For the ocean," he murmurs. "Let it remember being fed." You watch as it disappears into the deep. Then he turns to you, brushing kelp crumbs from his robe. "Next stop, the seaweed scroll scandal. Hope you're ready for some historical drama." You grin. "Always." Poseidon wipes his hands on a sponge towel, tosses the last seaweed crumbs to a grateful sardine, and motions for you to follow. "Now brace yourself," he says. This next bit has everything: betrayal, ink theft, and an eel with very strong opinions. You swim after him down a corridor lined with faded murals, scenes of scrolls, scribes, and squids, all painted in that overly dramatic ancient style, where everyone is either weeping or holding a quill, like it's about to duel someone. "This," Poseidon says, "is where we keep the infamous seaweed scrolls, or at least what's left of them." You arrive at a chamber that looks like a coral cathedral. Its domed ceiling is ribbed with pearl-encrusted arches, and a dozen massive scroll tubes float in preservation tanks filled with amber liquid. One of them is surrounded by a velvet rope and guarded by a cranky seahorse with a clipboard. "Still no touching?" Poseidon asks. The seahorse squints. "You licked it last time." "It smelled like lemon," the seahorse huffs. "It was cursed lemon." You drift past, eyes on the scrolls. Some are partially unrolled, their text faintly glowing. Symbols shimmer and rearrange themselves like they're alive. You recognize fragments of poems, recipes, warnings, and oddly specific laundry instructions for robes made of jellyfish silk. According to the disputed chronicles of the kelp scribes, the seaweed scrolls were created by Poseidon's earliest priesthood, a group of prophetic squid who believed that every meaningful event could be written in strands of seaweed and suspended in ink made from bioluminescent plankton. Historians still argue whether these writings were meant to foretell the future or just serve as poetic venting sessions. Poseidon points to one scroll labelled Scroll 7a, on the day the tide turned sideways. That one predicted the ocean would briefly forget how to be horizontal. It did. 3 hours of diagonal waves, very embarrassing. You drift toward a display of fragmented scrolls behind glass. A placard reads, "Seaweed, Scroll Scandal of the Third Wave. Era, contents redacted, accusations ongoing. Please do not feed the drama eels." You raise an eyebrow. "What happened?" Poseidon leans in, voice low. Now that was a mess. He gestures toward an exhibit featuring several very smug-looking fish portraits and a glowing ink pot chained to a pedestal. Around 12 centuries ago, a group of elite kelp scribes, mostly self-important sea cucumbers with flair, started forging entries into the official seaweed scrolls. They added flattering prophecies about themselves, deleted warnings about certain culinary disasters, and even inserted a love poem about one of their mollusk rivals. You gape. They rewrote history? Poseidon shrugs, more like they re-flavored it. The scandal broke when a young eel named Erasmus discovered that a recipe scroll had been tampered with. The original called for coral pepper, Poseidon recalls. The altered version replaced it with sun-dried barnacle flakes. 2 monks lost their taste buds for a decade. Erasmus published a counter-scroll, Scroll X. That's not what we wrote, sparking an underwater scholarly feud that spanned 3 generations. At one point, a formal debate turned into an ink fight, and the great coral haul had to be regrouted. You point to a smaller scroll, clearly less polished, scrawled in wobbly ink. What's that one? Poseidon smiles. That's the petition of the forgotten phrases. The lesser scribes demanded their edits be recognized too. One of them just added footnotes like, "This bit's kind of fishy and I was hungry when I wrote this." The scandal escalated until Poseidon himself had to intervene. "I didn't want to," he mutters. "But someone claimed a prophecy said I'd be replaced by a sea sponge with good hair." You ask how he handled it? "I sealed the forged scrolls in bubblestone and buried them under the sighing trench," he says. "They're still down there, muttering about misquotes." A passing jellyfish librarian adds, "We occasionally hear them correcting themselves. Last week, one tried to rhyme trident with violent, very ambitious." Poseidon turns to you, eyes serious now. "Words down here are sacred. Once you write something in seaweed ink, it lives, it drifts, it repeats, even when it's wrong." You nod, slowly. "People think the sea forgets," he says. "It doesn't. It just files things weirdly." He gestures to a wall mural showing a giant inked squid gently coiling around a scroll. Every story, honest or forged, changes the tide just a little. At the exit, you pass a display case with a sign, "Currently banned," phrases from the scrolls, "moist prophecy," "soggy destiny," "flavored fate," anything that rhymes ocean with motion again. You chuckle, Poseidon shrugs. "We have standards." Outside the archive, the sea feels lighter, less ink-scented. You both drift in silence for a moment. Then he asks, "Ever written something you regretted?" You nod. "Ever written something that felt silly, but later sacred?" You nod again. He smiles. "Then you understand." And with that, he turns toward the next ripple in your shared journey, the scrolls left behind like a whisper in the water. Poseidon hums softly to himself as he leads you away from the scroll archives, his hands clasped behind his back, kicking up little curls of silt with each step. "We've been poetic, we've been philosophical. Time for something truly absurd." You grin. "Define absurd," he smirks. 3 words, the Crustacean Olympics. You blink. "That's not what I was expecting." "Good," he says, "because nothing prepares you for crab javelin." He takes you through a series of narrow passageways that open suddenly into a massive arena carved from living coral, shaped like a shell spiral. Spectator eels coil along the perimeter. Dolphin ushers toss sea cucumber-shaped snacks. Above it all, banners flutter in soft currents, embroidered with clams high-fiving. "Welcome," Poseidon whispers dramatically, "to the fall 17th Annual Crustacean Games." You barely have time to process before a conch horn blasts. The crowd goes silent. A hermit crab wearing a golden shell and a suspiciously tiny crown scuttles into the arena, raises one claw high and shouts, "Let the shellthleets assemble." According to an appendix of the Barnacle Ledger of Competitive Absurdities, the Crustacean Games began as a minor distraction during an undersea drought, but escalated into a full-blown tradition after Poseidon accidentally awarded a gold pearl to a shrimp for enthusiasm. Historians still argue whether the games hold symbolic meaning or are just a yearly excuse for competitive somersaulting. The events begin. First up, synchronized shell spinning. Teams of mollusks twirl in elegant spirals to the rhythm of distant whale song, creating temporary mandalas in the sand. One octopus team is disqualified for excessive jazz tentacle. Next, kelp rope tug-of-war. Two teams of crabs pull on a slimy strand of ancient kelp while chanting motivational slogans like "Clamp strong" and "Pinch with honor." Then comes sand sculpting speed trials. Contestants race to carve majestic coral castles while dodging heckling puffers. One entry is a perfect replica of Poseidon's face, but with dramatic eyelashes and a tiny top hat. Poseidon leans over to you and whispers, "I feel seen." Midway through, a brawl breaks out during sea cucumber sumo. Two particularly stubborn competitors cling to each other and roll in slow motion for 15 straight minutes. The crowd eats it up. Literally, someone's passing out seaweed nachos. Poseidon gestures to a scoreboard made of blinking barnacles. You wouldn't believe how heated these rankings get. There was a scandal in the 300th Games. A jellyfish bribed the judges with glowing plankton and won best backflip. Still controversial. You glance at the leaderboard. Current, standings first. Team Red Rock, crabs second. The barnacle dudes third. Mollusk Mayhem, 989th. Dennis, a lone shrimp who forgot his team. You point to a snail carrying a tiny barbell. Weightlifting, Poseidon says. It's measured in metaphorical kilograms. Basically, if it looks impressive, you get points. A stingray flies overhead, trailing glitter. Poseidon explains it's the halftime show. Last year, it was interpretive algae ballet, he says. This year, speed poetry by seahorses. A spotlight finds the seahorse duo. They slam poems like, "I am the bubble in your dream. I pop, and yet remain." A lone barnacle weeps. The crowd erupts. Poseidon cheers. The final event is the most anticipated, trident toss. Tiny crabs with heroic capes climb a ceremonial sponge ramp and hurl miniature tridents at targets shaped like mythical monsters. Hydras, sea witches, and one labelled simply My Ex. One crab lands a bullseye, causing a clam judge to faint from excitement. Poseidon chuckles. She's won 5 years in a row. Trains by lifting barnacled children. The closing ceremony begins. Seaweed medals are distributed. There's a brief musical number featuring a clam choir and 3 very confused seals. Confetti made from crushed pearls rains down, though one eel grumbles it's economically irresponsible. Poseidon turns to you as the crowd begins to disperse. Why do I fund this every year? Because it's nonsense. Glorious, ceremonial nonsense. And because the sea needs play just as much as it needs depth. You look around at the joyful chaos, the laughing mollusks, the tiny shrimp, holding a participation trophy the size of his entire body. It's perfect, you say. He smiles. It's ours. You exit the arena through a tunnel lit by bioluminescent graffiti. One reads, "Pinch first, ask later." Another, "Crab up or shut up." Poseidon waves to a passing jellyfish vendor selling coral popsicles and hums softly. People think gods only care about storms and sacrifice, but sometimes we just need to watch a hermit crab attempt parkour. You both drift upward. Somewhere below, Dennis the shrimp finally finds his team. They cheer like he just won gold. Poseidon grins. Every now and then the ocean remembers to laugh. Poseidon is still chuckling as you leave the crustacean games behind, a faint trail of confetti caught in his beard. Well, he sighs, we've seen joy, mystery, betrayal, and crustaceans trying to backflip in armor. Want to visit something quieter? You nod, still reeling from the seahorse poetry. Good, he says. Then it's time for a visit to the shell graveyard. Your smile falters. That sounds less festive. He gives you a sidelong glance. It's not spooky, it's peaceful, maybe a little melancholy, but don't worry, no haunted barnacles. You drift downward, away from the crowded reefscape, and into a hushed part of the ocean floor, where even the light behaves politely. The colors soften, the currents slow, time itself seems to hold its breath. The shell graveyard is a sprawling basin dotted with millions of empty shells, each one positioned gently, deliberately. Conches, cowries, spiral whelks, broken clams. No two are alike. Some are pristine, others are cracked, all are silent. And somehow they all feel watched over. Every creature that's ever outgrown a home, Poseidon murmurs, left something behind here. You float carefully between the shells, the sound of your movement muted by the sand. A tiny spiral shell rests beneath a curtain of kelp, its opening turned toward the sunless sky. Nearby, a massive nautilus husk leans against a coral outcrop like an ancient couch long abandoned. According to the Pearl Registry of Transient Dwellings, the shell graveyard predates most recorded civilizations, perhaps even Poseidon himself. Historians still argue whether it formed naturally as a result of migration patterns, or if it was a divine construct intended as a monument to impermanence. Poseidon kneels beside a broken shell and runs his fingers over its ridges. "See this one?" he says. Used to house a hermit crab named Cressida. She carried poetry in here, scratched it into the walls. When she moved on, she left the shell facing east so the tide could whisper it back. You peer inside. The lines are faint, but you make out a few etched words. I was soft once, now I echo myself home, is what leaves you gently. You sit beside a crescent-shaped clam. Do you remember them all? Poseidon shakes his head. Not all, but I remember their reasons. He points across the field. That spiral, outgrown, that shattered shell, a fight, that row of conches, a species that migrated deeper, that polished one over there, a gift never claimed. You wander among the shells, finding tiny totems placed inside, a pearl, a sliver of coral, a strand of eel hair braided carefully and tucked like a bookmark. In one shell you find a single bead of glass. Poseidon leans over. A goodbye gift. A jellyfish left it for a friend who never came back. There's no bitterness here, just remembrance, soft, salt-washed memory, and reverence. One massive shell stands upright, its center hollowed into a gentle dome. Inside, an inscription reads, "If you've ever changed and wondered where the old you went, you're welcome here." Poseidon nods. We all outgrow something, even gods. You ask if he's ever left a shell here. He smiles faintly. A few. Parts of me that didn't fit anymore, angers I carried too long, expectations I never liked. An entire decade where I insisted on dramatic entrances. You chuckle. You? Dramatic? I had a lightning conch fanfare, he confesses. It was a lot. A current stirs the shells, making a soft clinking sound. It's not eerie, it's musical, like a wind chime made of memory. You notice a small gathering of sea creatures, crabs, seahorses, a very quiet octopus, sitting in a circle, each holding a shell. They don't speak, they just listen. To the silence, to the soft stories inside. Poseidon gestures toward them. People come here to leave things, griefs, names, even old versions of themselves. You sit quietly, cupping a tiny scallop shell in your hands. It's warm from the sand. Empty, but not alone. You can leave something too, Poseidon says softly. You think for a moment, and then carefully you place a thought inside the shell, something heavy but ready to be set down. You nestle it between two others and let it go. The tide accepts it without question. Poseidon places a hand on your shoulder. The sea remembers, but it also forgives. As you rise, you look back one last time. The shells stretch to the horizon, glittering softly like the stars beneath the waves, each one once a home, each one still listening. You leave the shell graveyard feeling lighter, as if the water itself has exhaled through your ribs. Poseidon floats beside you in thoughtful silence, eyes distant, his trident dangling loosely from his hand like a shopping bag he forgot was there. "All right," he finally says, "we've honored the past, ready to question the future?" You nod. He points upward toward a faint, glowing spiral in the distance. Time to visit the bubble of time. You rise slowly through thickening currents. The water around you starts to shimmer like liquid glass stretched too thin. The spiral grows larger, revealing a gentle vortex of pearly orbs, each one pulsing with soft light. At the center floats a hollowed sea sphere, lined with silken coral. And in the very middle, a teacup. It's steaming. "You're not hallucinating," Poseidon says. "This is exactly what it looks like." According to the Chronicles of Chrono Kelp, the bubble of time was a failed experiment by a sea witch who tried to trap a single, perfect afternoon in a bubble. She wanted more time to sip her tea before her crusts got soggy. Historians still argue whether this time pocket was an accident or a deliberate rebellion against Poseidon's tide schedules. She said she wanted a nap without consequences. Poseidon chuckles. Instead, she invented a temporal loop that resets every 30 minutes. You swim closer, the bubble wall tingles as you pass through. Instantly, the light shifts, sound fades, a peculiar calm settles into your bones. It's afternoon, permanently. Inside, a small coral table is set for two. The tea is warm, the cakes are suspiciously moist. Poseidon pours for you both. "You've entered what I call intermission eternity," he says. "Time doesn't move here, not forward, not backward. It just sits, like a cat, or an unopened bill. You take a sip. It tastes like something you once dreamed about as a child, a memory you can't quite name, sweet and unfinished. What happens if you stay too long, you ask?" He shrugs. "Nothing, that's the problem." You look around. A snail is slowly rereading the same page of a book titled Time Management for the Timeless. A squid is napping on a couch, blinking every 10 minutes. A jellyfish is doing embroidery that never progresses. "They've been here for years," Poseidon says, "but only 30 minutes. You sit with that for a moment. Then you notice a painting on the wall, one of Poseidon himself, frozen mid-laugh, a tea biscuit halfway to his mouth. He sighs. "Yeah, I stayed once. Too long. Thought I'd rest for just a cycle. Woke up with a beard extension and no clue what century it was." You sip again. The tea is still warm. "I let this place exist," Poseidon says softly, "for those who need to pause. Not stop, just pause." You watch the snail reread a line and nod with satisfaction. "But," he continues, "stay too long and nothing changes, not even you." He stands, and time stands with him. You realize he's not just Poseidon the sea god, he's Poseidon the caretaker of loops, the one who lets people drift, but knows when to nudge them back to shore. "Ready?" he asks. You glance at your cup. The steam is still curling in the exact same shape it made when you first arrived. You nod. You pass through the bubble wall again, and the world outside rushes back in. Movement, noise, salty breeze. Somewhere far off, a clam is yelling about rent again. You glance back. The bubble remains, still steeping, still waiting. Poseidon places a gentle hand on your shoulder. "Good things can stay, but better things move." He gestures ahead. "Let's head toward a reef I call the Shelf of Almosts. It's where the sea keeps the ideas it never quite finished." You smile. "Like what?" "Oh," he says, "like the time I tried to invent underwater popcorn, or ocean-based time zones, or emotionally supportive kelp." You laugh. "Those sound useful." "They weren't," he says, "but they were fascinating." As you glide onward, the water clears and your sense of time settles again. 30 minutes lost, or gained. Maybe both. Maybe that's the point. The ocean around you brightens as you drift onward, stirred gently by Poseidon's effortless movement. He gestures toward a ridged outcropping up ahead, a coral formation shaped like staggered ledges, each shelf dotted with forgotten things. "This," he announces, "is the Shelf of Almosts." From a distance, it resembles a massive bookcase carved from pink limestone, worn smooth by ages of current and contemplation. But as you draw closer, you see the truth. This isn't a library. It's a museum of ideas, of half-finished thoughts and underwater inventions that never made it past the prototype stage. "Welcome," Poseidon says solemnly, "to where ambition naps." You hover beside the first shelf. Resting there is an ornate seashell headset, tangled in kelp wire. A tag reads Echo Shell 1.0, designed to let dolphins listen to whale poetry in real time. Failed due to constant hiccup translation bugs. Poseidon winces. We didn't account for sonar interference, or the fact that whales speak in emotional paragraphs. You glance at the next shelf, a spherical glass orb filled with glowing water and a tiny spiral of blue ink suspended inside. Idea, seed, undersea skywriting, ink released from squid drones to write messages visible from shore. Abandoned due to pelican misinterpretations. Oh, right, Poseidon says. One test message was meant to say peace, but came out as peas. War nearly broke out with the coastal farmers. According to a lesser-known appendix of the mythical maritime manual of misfires, the Shelf of Almosts began as a private collection, Poseidon's attempt to document the things he thought might change the sea. Historians still argue whether this collection was meant to inspire future sea dwellers or just keep Poseidon humble. You move to the second level. There you find a pair of coral shoes with tiny propellers on the soles. Tide treaders for faster underwater walking, cancelled due to seahorse stampede. Poseidon chuckles. Turns out no one really wants to walk underwater, it's all about the glide. Next to it, a kelp-wrapped package labelled Aquatic Time Zones and a calendar shaped like a jellyfish. You really tried dividing the sea into time zones? He shrugs. Whales wanted to be punctual. Sharks said no. The meeting ended in confusion and mild nibbling. You reach a dusty shelf covered in barnacles where half-melted wax figures sit beside a series of sealed jars labelled Feelings Not Fully Formed. One is labelled Ambition with No Direction. Another, Gratitude Mixed with Kelp Envy. You glance at Poseidon. I kept those, he says softly, because sometimes the sea feels things it doesn't know how to name. There's a silence between you, a quiet born not of awkwardness, but of recognition. Even gods have unfinished business. On the third shelf, a faded scroll reads, Fish choir sheet music, ocean hymns in B minor, discontinued after first rehearsal due to dramatic puffers. Poseidon groans. The altos kept inflating out of sync. Total disaster. You float near a compartment filled with half-written letters. Some are angry, some are aching. One simply reads, I meant to say more. You ask if these are his. He nods. Some are mine, some were left behind by others. This shelf doesn't judge. Another contains a trident fork with 3 differently sized prongs. Prototype for universal utensil, too confusing, accidentally blessed one side. There's even a cloak made of tiny barnacles, stitched together in a patchwork quilt. Armour of sentimentality, offers no real protection, but makes the wearer remember old songs. You ask, why keep these? He runs a hand over the barnacle stitching, because not everything needs to work to be worth remembering. You glance around. Every object here once carried hope, absurdity, love, or longing. They may have failed, but they were tried. Poseidon picks up a shell flute missing 2 holes and raises it to his lips. It lets out a low, uncertain whoop that sounds like a confused walrus. You laugh. He laughs. Every god needs a junk drawer, he says. Mine just happens to be 30 meters long and blessed with faint bioluminescence. You drift toward the top shelf, marked Maybe, Someday, and find a sealed box covered in shimmering scales. You ask what's inside. Poseidon smiles. No idea. I left it there to surprise myself later. He looks around. All these things almost mattered. Maybe some still do. Ideas are like waves. You don't know which ones will reach shore. You nod, slowly. And the ones that don't? He shrugs. They ripple elsewhere. As you leave, you glance back. The shelves seem to rearrange themselves slightly, a whisper of current, shifting old dreams into new patterns. And perhaps, somewhere in the depths, one of them stirs again, waiting to be remembered. The last of the shelf of almosts fades behind you, its gentle glow dissolving into the current like the memory of an almost dream. Poseidon stretches his arms overhead with a long, satisfied sigh. You've seen the silly, the sacred, and the shells. But now, he says, voice hushed with a grin, we arrive at something older than even me. You blink. Is that possible? Oh yes, he replies. I may have shaped the tides, but this place... It was here before I had sandals. He waves his trident, and the water parts just slightly ahead, a narrow crack in the seafloor, widening with a slow creak, revealing a gently sloping trench lined with shimmering sand. As you follow him downward, the light fades, but it never quite goes dark. Instead, the darkness turns soft, as if someone had woven it from velvet. Welcome to the Whalefall Cathedral. It's quiet, the kind of quiet that listens back. You reach the base of the trench, and there it is, an immense skeleton resting peacefully on the seabed. A great whale, long gone but not forgotten. Its bones curve into natural archways, ribs spiraling upward like the vaulted ceiling of a sunken chapel. Algae drapes like stained glass. Crabs crawl reverently between vertebrae. Fish dart respectfully, as if trying not to disturb the hush. This is what happens, Poseidon whispers, when the sea remembers you. A whale fall, as marine biologists call it, is what occurs when a whale dies and its body sinks to the ocean floor. For decades, sometimes centuries, it becomes an ecosystem all its own, a floating banquet, then a home, then a memory. According to the more lyrical pages of the Deepwater Almanac, early undersea civilizations believed that whale skeletons marked the hearts of ancient oceans. Historians still argue whether these cathedrals were ever used in ceremonies or simply venerated by instinct. Poseidon walks slowly between the great bones, dragging his fingertips along the calcified walls. I used to think power was about action, he says. Storms, quakes, splashes. But then I sat here and realized stillness shapes the world just as much. He pauses beside the whale's skull, a massive dome of worn bone etched with bioluminescent moss. Someone has painted tiny constellations across it. Not the stars above, but imagined ones only the ocean could name. You ask, do you know which whale this was? Poseidon kneels. I think her name was Luma, he says quietly. She sang once every 3 years, low, long songs that made kelp forests dance. She fed 1,000 creatures in life, and another 1,000 in death. You notice creatures nestled among the bones, a sleeping eel coiled in a jawbone, anemones blooming gently from the spine, tiny glowing shrimp gathering in the eye socket like monks in meditation. Poseidon gestures to a stone basin carved into the sand near the ribcage. That's the offering pool. You don't leave objects. Just a moment. You kneel beside it. The pool reflects not your face, but flickering glimpses of old memories. A hand held, a word left unsaid, a sky you once watched without knowing why. You close your eyes and place something wordless into the water. It ripples once, then stills. Poseidon is beside you when you open them again. Whale falls are reminders, he says, that even the biggest lives become part of something else, something bigger than they ever knew. You wander to the tailbones, which stretch like frozen motion across the seafloor. Near them, etched carefully in shell ink, is a simple poem. I carried oceans, then became one, do not weep. The tide was always mine, you stare at it for a long time. A soft bell chime echoes faintly through the water. You look up. Tiny crabs are ringing, coral chimes hanging from the ribs. A ritual. Not for gods, not even for whales, but for remembrance. Poseidon stands beside you, his expression unreadable. There are older gods than me, he says. None wear crowns, none demand prayers, but they teach you how to leave well. You sit in silence for a while, listening to the creak of the sea, shifting gently through the bones. No music, no grand declarations, just a place to rest. You finally rise. Poseidon brushes a bit of sand from your shoulder. You're different now, he says. Not louder, not bigger, just deeper. As you ascend from the trench, the cathedral fades behind you. Not gone, just distant, the way all sacred things are when we return to the surface. As the whale fall recedes into the shadows below, Poseidon drifts in silence beside you, his eyes soft, the line of his brow quiet with thought. The sea has grown warmer here, the water turning pale and golden, as though it's absorbing light from some place you can't quite see. You break the silence first. Where to next? He smiles. The last door. A coral archway emerges ahead, tall, narrow, shimmering faintly. It stands in the middle of open water with no walls, no hinges, no frame, just the idea of a door. Around it, hundreds of tiny fish hover, blinking slowly, like they're trying to remember why they came. This, Poseidon says, is the threshold of forgotten names. You pause. What kind of names? He exhales. The ones we never say aloud, not because we don't remember them, but because they changed, or stopped fitting, or dissolved. You step through, nothing changes, and yet everything feels different. Inside, if you can call it that, is a vast seafloor meadow, a field of soft, waving seagrass under a pale blue light that seems to come from within the water, not above it. Across the field are stone tablets, each partially covered in sand, many with no writing left. Others bear faint symbols, a handprint, a single letter, a swirl. They're not gravestones, Poseidon says gently. They're acknowledgements. You don't bury someone here. You recognize who they used to be. He kneels beside a blank stone and brushes it clean. Names are weighty things, he says. We grow into them, grow out of them, sometimes get given ones we never asked for. According to the fringe scholars of the Eel School of Identity Drift, the threshold of forgotten names predates language. It's a place the ocean set aside for transformation, not the sudden, dramatic kind, but the slow, molting kind. Historians still argue whether the name loss is voluntary, or if the sea simply absorbs what we no longer need. You kneel beside a stone of your own. At first, it seems blank, but then faint lines emerge, memories of who you were when you didn't know who you'd become. The version of you that hesitated, that over-explained, that believed something was broken when it was just becoming different. Go on, Poseidon says. You can let go here. You place your fingers against the stone. You don't carve. You don't speak. You just breathe. And for a moment, the water stills. A soft current lifts the name you thought you'd carry forever and carries it into the seagrass. It doesn't vanish. It becomes part of something else. You look up. Across the meadow, you see a row of names hovering faintly above the stones, not in letters but in feelings. The name of someone who used to be brave, someone who used to be silent, someone who laughed like waves crashing but learned to whisper. Poseidon drifts to a pillar etched with a symbol that looks like three tides braided together. That, he says, was me, a long time ago, before I was Poseidon, before anyone needed gods. You stare. What were you? He tilts his head, just a ripple, curious, restless. You smile. You still are. He laughs. Don't tell the temples. The two of you sit quietly at the edge of the meadow, watching the tide roll across the stones. A seahorse passes slowly overhead, trailing threads of bioluminescent silk. In its glow, you see names you almost had. Stories you almost lived, lives you almost chose. You realize they're not gone. They just stepped aside to make space. Poseidon places a hand on your shoulder. You're allowed to change, even if no one notices, even if no one claps. He leans close, especially if no one claps. A current of warm water flows past you both, and something shifts in your chest. Not a loss, not a wound, just release. You rise. He follows. Behind you, the forgotten names settle again into quiet. They're not forgotten at all, they're held. You and Poseidon drift upward now, slowly, gently, as if the sea itself were holding your back and easing you toward the surface. But there is no rush, no final push, no dramatic swell. Just a patient ascent through glowing columns of kelp and quiet schools of fish, that part respectfully around you. Before we finish, Poseidon says, voice hushed and steady, there's one last place I want you to see. You glance over. His face is calm, but there's something else in his expression now, something like gratitude, or maybe reverence. This isn't a temple, he adds. Not officially, but it's where the sea says thank you. You break through a gentle layer of warmer current into a clearing of open water. No caves, no ruins. Just a wide expanse where the light hits the seafloor in soft, swirling patterns. 1,000 tiny bubbles rise upward, like silent applause. This, Poseidon says, gesturing with an open palm, is the place of quiet offerings. It's beautiful in the way that only things untouched can be. No plaques, no monuments, just a slow-motion ballet of plankton drifting through beams of dappled light. According to a nearly forgotten scrap of the Saltwater Folklore Codex, this place formed when the sea itself responded to kindness. A reef that had been healed instead of harvested, a creature rescued instead of hunted, a moment of mercy offered without witness. Historians still argue whether it's a natural formation or a divine echo. You watch as a small fish swims to the center of the open water and pauses. It doesn't do anything special, it just pauses and then moves on. That's all it takes here, Poseidon says. To stop, to notice, to leave a bit of care behind. He reaches into the pouch on his belt and removes something wrapped in old seaweed, a small object, smooth and pale. He unwraps it slowly and reveals a single, glistening pebble. I found this, he says, on a shore where no one had ever walked. It was shaped like a wave. I kept it for a long time. You ask why now? He smiles. Because it's time. He floats to the center of the clearing, cradles the pebble with both hands, and lets it drift slowly from his palms. It turns once, twice, then settles gently into the sand. A shimmer pulses outward, not bright, not loud, just enough to feel. The water itself seems to sigh. You drift beside him. I don't know if the sea is grateful, you whisper. Poseidon replies, I think it is. Not like a person, more like a mirror. It gives back what you offer, sometimes distorted, sometimes clearer. You both sit and just listen. To the hush of the deep, to the absence of urgency, to the quiet that isn't empty but full. You notice something in the sand beside you, a smooth stone, carved with a faint spiral. You reach down, pick it up, and you realize this is your moment. No gods watching, no audience, just you. You place the stone beside Poseidon's, not as an ending, but as a small, silent promise. Poseidon smiles. You've travelled far, you nod. Hand deep. He rises slowly. Time to return. But before you leave, he says one last thing. Don't try to remember all this. Let it sink into you. Let it change you in ways you won't notice until the right tide comes. You rise. The sea lifts with you, and far below the quiet offerings remain. Not forgotten, just planted, like seeds. The sea recedes behind your mind now, like the tide pulling away from the shore, not vanishing, just slipping softly out of view. The images you've seen tonight, shells and scrolls, crab games and cathedral bones, they begin to blur at the edges, not because they didn't matter, but because your thoughts are finally heavy with stillness. Your breath slows, the world becomes quieter. You might still feel the brush of seagrass at your fingertips, or the cool shape of a pebble in your palm. Let it stay, let it drift inside you like a lullaby carried by waves. And as the last light of Poseidon's journey fades, remember, not all adventures roar. Some whisper, some wait, and some simply walk beside you, asking nothing but your presence. This night was not about noise, it was about depth. Not about knowing everything, but feeling a little more whole than you did before. You are not lost. You are not behind. You are simply here, drifting, softly, held. Now let the last bubbles rise. Let the current cradle you. And if your mind wanders, let it. That's the sea's way of tucking you in. Sleep deeply, traveler beneath the waves. You're exactly where you need to be.